So yeah, it was like this wild thing where the one American kid in the entire school, and 9/11 just became how Osama bin Laden had personally victimized him, like, personally. It was like this thing where it was like, it was all about him. And I think like even like teachers and stuff were very indulgent in this because they probably wouldn't have any idea how to handle it. And also he was just like saying extremely out of pocket stuff about like how, like his uncle had been on one of the planes and had tried to take on the attackers, and like, like how he was like a hero and all this kind of stuff like that. And it was just like, like there was a bunch of people that knew this kid, and we were kind of like, like, I don't know, like the family and everything that he had told us about in the past was very different to the, like the family of war hero veterans that are, taking on terrorists and stuff now. But yeah, like I was thinking it's like probably not a thing inside of America, but for the American diaspora, like kids that are out in schools outside of, America, like kids that are in schools in, I guess, like other imperial core countries, like, New Zealand and the UK and stuff, it seems like there's a vibe to the one American kid at your school.
That is so like, great. I love that so much.
It's a weird thing. I feel like every time I've been to school and there was like an American kid, it's like, oh yeah, he's like extremely American,
Ooh, welcome to Red Planet, everybody. And I love that, Tim. I love that story. It's everything that Americans are. It's especially when they're not in their country of origin or not origin, as we're going to be talking about on the show later on today. But we will be starting the show in the traditional way of asking our hosts, Tim in particular, what was the most base thing that you did this week?
Well, so I am on the verge of moving house. I've got to move like next week. Only just found out that I had got the house like this week, the start of this week. So it's been like very like all go. So yeah, I've been like downsizing everything that I own. Like years. This is years and years and years worth of like collecting books, things, video games, all kinds of stuff, just like whatever. So have been purging like so much stuff. But one thing that has been really interesting is just giving things away to people through community pages, which is like actually sick as hell.
Nice.
So what do you mean by community pages?
Oh, like, do you have that over there where it's like on Facebook or whatever, you might have like some people in your neighborhood will have
like neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like the Wild West, like it like just feral most of the time, or it'll be like a group of like people that'll be like, did anyone see this? Like this car driving slowly through our street that, whatever, like just bullshit, whatever. But it's actually, it turns out it's really good for just like getting rid of stuff. My favorite interaction out of all of these so far has been, because I've gotten rid of heaps of stuff from, like, I had like a huge box of like art supplies and things from over the years from various different things that I've tried out. And, like people like get in touch from like community groups and they're like, would this be good for kids, whatever, blah blah blah. But anyway, one of the best was I had this huge box of CDs that is like just CDs that I had built up, that collected over my whole life, going back to like when I first started buying CDs in like the late 90s, early 2000s or whatever, like all kinds of stuff. I put them up and I put up a thing saying this is mostly kind of heavy and alternative stuff or whatever, pretty extreme metal, kind of like, then there's like Y2K kind of new metal and like kind of weird goth industrial shit, whatever. But like, like all kinds of random other shit as well. And I put it up thinking that it would be like this kind of grizzled old, like, dude in a Metallica shirt showing up because he wanted some like CDs for his like truck or something like that. And it was actually like this young like gothy kind of queer kid who like came down the driveway and was like, yeah, my best friend just bought a CD player and we're like really looking forward just to like listening to CDs and like having sleepovers and stuff. And I was like, fuck, this is so good. Like
that's
actually
awesome.
going to like people that are gonna like experience them, you know, like they're gonna have
Fucking
like a
rocks.
little thing and they're gonna flick through and look at the artwork and be like, what does this sound like, or whatever. So that was really cool. Also quite, I guess, like liberating on my end, where it's like, man, this is like so much shit I've been carrying around.
Let go of your earthly possessions, Tim. Get rid of it.
I know, right? Yeah, get rid of it all. Just gonna own nothing and be happy. What about you, Mule? What have you been up to?
Well, I've not done too much, quote unquote. I guess, not too much like activism. Yeah, some people might call what I've done activism, but it's very, very small and it's very, very silly. But I think a lot of people know that I'm on a big growing stuff tip at the minute. I have become a soft soil boy. It's my entire personality now. I'm really proud of all my plants. Even though I'm doing indoor planting, I've been mulching and everything. So all like dead leaves that have fallen off my plants, I've been like putting that on the soil, even though I don't think it's necessary for indoor plants, but I want to make sure that they feel like they're as outside as possible. I'm a plant dad.
That's so cute.
Yeah, I genuinely love it. It has actually, and I know I'm sort of being a bit jestful here. I'm having a jape or two. But I genuinely have gotten a lot of fulfillment from it, and it's really, really nice. And I do think that it's just great for the soul. So what I actually did this week was I reminded myself that nature gives to everybody freely without asking for money or discriminating against any of us. So what I actually did was I claimed a lavender plant that belongs to me. It belongs to all of us, actually, and I have planted it just in a little homemade plant pot that I made there. Yeah, and apparently lavender like really enjoys absolutely garbage soil. If you're watching by the way, if you're on the podcast version, you won't be able to see this, but I'm showing this off on the video version of this show. So if you wanted an incentive to go over to YouTube and check us out on there, you should absolutely go and do that. But yeah, so lavender apparently really likes like absolutely dog shit soil, like not soil with dog shit in it, but like just the worst soil, like with no nutrients in. It really, really likes to just have a struggle. Like that's what it's all about. It's its whole vibe, and it was completely true because I got 2 sprigs of lavender. And I put one in like a very heavily watered, fresh compost pot, and it just fucking curled up and died like instantly overnight. But this one is doing quite well. It's not doing too bad. It's bent over at the top a little bit. I don't know what that's about. Hopefully, it doesn't mean it's going to die, but it seems like it's sort of staying alive. It's pretty green. The leaves are out. It's it's vibing. So that is the most base thing that I did this week.
That you liberated the plant.
Nice. I did. I liberated the plant from its awful, awful urban environment and put it into another, even more awful urban environment. What about our sweet Kara? What is the most base thing you did this week?
Thanks for asking, Mule. I'm excited to say that I recorded a podcast with Conrad Zimmerman, our producer, and Sophie from Mars, our bestie, our adorable bestie, Sophie. We recorded a podcast about the Democrats. So it's conspiracy theories about the Democrats. And the name of the podcast hasn't been announced yet. Is what I'm hearing.
Coming in quick.
However, this is going to be Patreon bonus content for every single Red Planet patron. So no matter what tier you subscribe to, you'll have access to it. Let me tell you, I had a really, really good time. It was super duper fun. I highly recommend becoming a patron, if only just for the access to these podcasts, because they're going to be great. It was really, really fun. I really enjoyed it. And that's it. That's the most base thing I did.
Incredible.
Thanks.
Our Sophie, who is not here this week, she went to the amazing ZAD to get a bunch of footage for a documentary about the ZAD, which will also be something that's coming very, very soon. I'm sure there's going to be like multiple versions of it, multiple different types of clips and long form, short form video. But from everything that she's told us, and also everything that she spoke about in the Red Planet official Discord. It sounds like she had an absolutely wonderful, amazing time. I'm really excited to check out all the footage, and I'm sure it's going to be really, really awesome. So big up our Sophie for going over and doing that. We also have a based viewer this week. So Nistria got in touch with us and told us that she has been working for a year for a soulless company that services POS systems and ATMs and just maintaining capitalism in general. She got an IT job with the local co-op association. It's union and definitely planning on getting involved with that as soon as she can. And she's already a member owner now. So now she's a worker owner. Absolutely incredible stuff. It's apparently a product of Western Canada, specifically Saskatchewan's surprisingly socialist history, and working there is like living in a social democracy, she says. Still capitalist, but not as monstrous, and she hopes to agitate from the inside to try and push co-workers further left. Absolutely amazing, Nistria.
That's great. We love, things like that. You know, like a lot of people I see, you know, sometimes I see people being like, oh, you know, like, it's still, you know, like a capitalist business or something like that when you talk about co-ops and stuff. But I think that like any step towards a more democratic workplace is amazing. And it's kind of like, yeah, obviously we're not living under a, you know, we're still living under the economic system that is capitalism.
I do think it's always good for us to reiterate that this isn't actually communism and this isn't actually socialism, just for the only reason that there's so many people out there that do try to do like a CIA work of recuperating. The fight for like the enemy to try to recuperate things that we do to try to advance our cause is a real thing. But after we mention that, I think we should congratulate people for taking these steps because this is incredible stuff. Like you said, living according to your values as best you can, given the oppressive environment you've been thrust into against your will. Yeah. I think it's awesome. It's very base.
And I think generally as well, the structure of these businesses is just going to make you a happier employee. But yeah, awesome. Great work, Nistria. I hope it works out for you, pushing people further left, and you know, sounds like things are going good. So so if you are a viewer that has had something cool like that happen, or you've done something cool where it's like, you know, been part of a protest action, it's been doing something in the workplace, anything like that, you can message us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok, or send us an email to based@redplanetshow.com. If you include your name and pronouns, we can include it. We'll shout it out in an episode. If you want to, we can do it anonymously as well. We don't have to name you, but let us know in the message if you do want to go anonymously or not. Otherwise, yeah, cool. All right. Well, so should we get into some news then? Yes. Well, Mule, so our last episode, we were talking to a representative of Sarah Jane Baker. If you all remember, why don't you give us a little update on the situation going on with her, Mule?
My pleasure, comrade. So Sarah Jane Baker has been acquitted on the charge of inciting violence that we were talking about on that show. So Sarah Jane Baker has been found not guilty by the City of London Magistrates Court on charges of inciting violence during Trans Pride. The charges stemmed from a speech Baker gave at the event in which she said, "If you see a TERF, punch them in the fucking face." Red Planet gives no comment to that particular statement, but police initially chose to take no action. But after pressure from MP Suella Braverman and other transphobes, they arrested Sarah Jane Baker 4 days later. Genuinely, if you want more information on this particular news story, you could check out our last episode. As Tim said, we spoke in depth to Anita. I forget her surname, but Anita is one of Sarah Jane Baker's longtime comrades and her legal representative. And it was a very, very in-depth discussion just about the sort of overreach that the Home Office took in that particular instance. Baker has actually apologized for the statement, saying that she did not intend for the speech to result in violence against anyone, and that she just wanted to get attention for some of the causes that she believes in. And of course, because she has been imprisoned in the past. She's an ex-convict. Her status as a parolee meant that she was actually remanded to a men's prison while awaiting trial. This is a trans woman, and we spoke about this at length, as I said on the previous episode, and it was just very, very obvious that this was just a huge, massive attempt at the government to just be like, well, let's see if we could get away with just putting trans women in men's prisons, and they did it like just for no fucking reason. There was no actual sort of like law that she broke. The sort of like inciting violence thing was sort of like tacked on to the end of this whole scenario. So very, very just vile behavior. Fuck the Home Office, fuck Suella Braverman. Deputy Chief Magistrate Tan Ikram expressed doubt but ultimately sided with Baker's claim. However, Sarah Jane Baker unfortunately remains in custody pending a parole hearing currently expected in March of next year. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with my stream, which is encourage all of you listening at home or in the chat right now to go to freesarahjanebaker.com. That's Sarah spelled Sarah, Jane Jane, Baker Baker. freesarahjanebaker.com. Write Sarah an email. It takes 2 seconds. If you believe in prison abolition, if you believe in the human right to freedom of speech and protest and all that stuff, it's just very, very simple. Sending you love and solidarity. You don't even have to sign your name. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff can mean the world to someone who is experiencing the full force of the state by being in prison. So that is the story right there. Love and solidarity to Sarah Jane Baker. But our next story, Kira is going to tell us about some other Turf Island bollocks.
I sure am, Mule. So the UK government is being reported to the UN over a strike law. So I'm going to tell you more about that. The Trades Union Congress, aka the TUC, I guess TUC. I don't know.
Yep, it's TUC.
Okay. TUC says it's reporting the UK government to the UN watchdog on workers' rights over a new strikes law. So right now, the UK government is doing some really, really oppressive stuff to workers in order to try to force people to work, despite the fact that they're unionized, despite the fact that they're trying to strike. Under the new law, which will apply to England, Scotland, and Wales, the government will require some unionized employees to work during industrial action or face being fired. And on top of that, the union could even be sued by the company for losses. There would also be no automatic protection from unfair dismissal for an employee who is told to work through a notice but chooses to strike. The government says that the new rules, quote, protect the lives and livelihoods of the general public, as well, end quote, as well as access to public services.
I love how it's like they say like, oh yeah, like these people have to suffer to protect like the working people, whatever, like the average person, but it's like these workers are those people, like which is something that I think they always try and say that, right? Like it's the same with in America, like when they were pushing frontline workers to go back in and stuff like that. It's like these are the people that are these are the people that are suffering, these are the people that are at risk. There's no delineation between like the people that even the people that like wish that life could go back to normal and the people that are going to work and stuff. It's like this is the working class.
Mm-hmm. No, Tim, there's the general public and then there's the other people.
Then there's the ungrateful workers.
the ungrateful workers who are trying to ruin the experiences of the general public. These people only exist in the workplace, and they don't actually exist in the general public. Apparently. If this is sarcasm, by the way. This is a lot of sarcasm. Of course, these people are part of the general public. It's ridiculous that we would try to divvy them up and say they're not part of the general public that's suffering or needs to be like whose rights need to be preserved. Anyways, so once implemented, the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act will apply to a wide range of workers, including those in the rail industry and emergency services. So the TUC said the legislation falls short of international legal standards. They're labeling them anti-strike laws and or saying that they might even be illegal. I'm not really sure where this is going to go. I don't know if any of my Red Planet correspondents have any expectations of where this is going to go, given that it's the UN trying to do anything about anything. Especially in the face of like the entire United Kingdom trying to oppress workers.
As the resident Brit, honestly, I have very little hope in general. So I also have very little hope that this is going to do anything. It's good, like the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, has been doing like a lot of work mobilizing and organizing trade unions, during the last year of huge strike action, the massive wave of strike action that we've seen, not just in the UK, all over the world, but particularly the TUC is a UK organization. And, they've done lots of really base stuff. From what I remember, various sort of like stories that we spoke about them on here, and also like going to rallies that they've organized. They're pro-trans, they're anti-racist, pro-GRT, like they're very, very, very based. And so I think they're doing everything in their power to be like, right, we got to make sure that the workers are protected in the UK. We got to make sure that people just can't suffer because they choose to strike. But I think that is good in and of itself. But I'm very doubtful to see, because we talk about things that the UN has been informed of all the time here on Red Planet. Like, for example, the things that Israel does to Palestinians, and nothing really happens about that.
Yeah,
so.
It's like, when you think about it, it's like, wow, Israel is like, well, the UN are pretty guilty of helping engineer a lot of the Palestine-Israel
Exactly.
conflict in the first place. So it's like, I think at the end of the day, it's it's like that bigger picture thing where it's like you look at it, okay, like how is this going to affect, what are the movements of capital surrounding this? It's like, and this is, what they're trying to do is like disempower any, like the ability to strike for, so many workers and stuff like that. And I would unfortunately say that, that obviously aligns with the goals of capital or whatever. And I wouldn't expect the UN to come in too hot on this. Like, I feel like it's going to be like our hands are tied situation, but we'll see what's going on.
I have an actual solution. I think I just worked out the math. I don't know if this might be a breaking news here at Red Planet.
Breaking news segment.
I think there is a way that workers can serve the general public, quote unquote, while also not being, outrageously oppressed. Granted, it's capitalism, but not being outrageously oppressed. And it's called giving workers more money.
Whoa. Yeah. I don't think, oh my God. Listen, if this is true, absolutely astonishing. Great work. Thank you.
Yeah,
Kara,
no problem.
For this report.
This is an official Red Planet breaking news segment.
Yeah. Then more money equal more good for workers.
More good for workers.
It's controversial, but
listening to workers, actually, maybe that would be the solution.
We'll get our research team to look into it.
But Mule, now that I've reported on your country, how about you report on my country? What's happening in Georgia?
This is the country that Kira owns. No,
I'm responsible for it.
Basically, this is one of the. It's quite similar, actually. I want to just go out on a limb here and say this is a sort of similar state overreach of power to the Sarah Jane Baker story. Lots of people will have probably heard of this, but this is about these 61 Cop City activists who were hit with RICO charges by Georgia's Republican Attorney General. So in what is being called a petty revenge indictment, quote, by many commenters, 61 environmentalist activists have been indicted on RICO charges by the same grand jury in the state of Georgia that just a couple of months ago indicted former President Donald Trump. In fact, I just want to correct that. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. The activists who have been involved in the Stop Cop City campaign for various amounts of time, differing from individual to individual, were described by Republican State Attorney General Chris Carr as, quote, anarchist terrorists who are, quote, anti-business and, quote, anti-police. However based those crimes sound, the implications of this indictment are broadly bad news if the state achieves convictions on these charges, as most of the details relate to how the anarchists use mutual aid and solidarity to support and care for each other. These are terms that are actually listed in the charges sheet. So the charges that were brought against them, when people in the system are reading through it, it describes the actual process of mutual aid, the actual definition of the term solidarity, and that could, of course, mean that if it's successful, the convictions could mean that these phrases are then keywords for identifying enemies of the state and endangering the freedoms of hundreds of thousands of leftist activists, from trade unionists to anti-racist activists and beyond. So just a quick, update, or if you're new to the show, Cop City is a huge $19 million, I think. I might even be more than that. It might be $90 million. There's a 9 in there somewhere.
The more they dig, the more they find. It's even more and more and more than they ever estimate.
Yeah.
So it's
an point. It's an absurd development. They're destroying a huge swath of Atlanta's forest. I think it's literally just called Atlanta Forest, which is sort of in the I want to call it like on the way to the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, and it's in a primarily black neighborhood. It's in a sort of like, just in general, like a very deprived neighborhood, and it's basically a practice city where and people have called it this. They've called it, I heard this on the Benjamin P. Dixon show, it was a consolation prize for the cops for the George Floyd uprisings. You know, the activists who were involved in the uprisings got nothing in the way of changing racism in America. But what the cops have gotten as a reward for injuring, arresting, and even killing some protesters in those protests is Cop City, a place where they can learn to do those things a lot better. Now, there's a lot of different controversies associated with Cop City. For example, the fact that they had now this is legitimately true. They had what do they call it? Like a panel of people to discuss and say whether they want this thing built in the city. And there was an overwhelming decline of people who wanted. People did not want this. Like 70% of the people there said, no, we don't want this being built in our forest. We don't want this being built in Atlanta at all. And that was even with a biased jury. Like the jury did not the jury, sorry, the I guess the committee, it would have been a committee, a biased committee. The committee did not contain any residents of the area where it was going to be built. It contained an overwhelming amount of people who were involved in law enforcement, fire department, EMT workers. So it's just a very, very, very vile, obvious, like, abuse of state power and police power, and it's an opportunity for police to be trained in more urban combat scenarios where they are literally going to be putting down any kind of dissent. So in response to this, a call has been put out by Devin Franklin, who is the Movement Policy Counsel from the Southern Center for Human Rights, which is a big legal. I think it does like some free legal aid and stuff. The Southern Center for Human Rights, for every lawyer in the USA who supports justice and activism to provide legal aid for the indicted activists. And Kiana Jones, one of the organizers for Stop Cop City, called it a retaliation, quote, retaliation for anyone who seeks to oppose the government here in Georgia. We couldn't agree more. Solidarity and love to the activists and all of our Forest Defender comrades in Atlanta, Georgia. But Tim, you have got some awesome news for us from, I think you said it was the Maori Party in New Zealand?
Yes. The Maori Party, who officially renamed a little while back to Te Pāti Māori, which is just the Maori language version of the Maori Party, have just announced a bunch of their new policies. We're coming up to an election here in New Zealand. So everyone's busting out their new policies, and while a lot of the kind of liberal parties are doing, like giving pretty weak shit. Like we've had some really good stuff from the left this time. The Greens the Greens and Te Pāti Māori have put out really good tax policies that actually beat the conservative right-wing parties for like average, the average New Zealander saving money, all this kind of shit, like beating them on the financial shit. And which is good because I think that gets a lot of the liberals and like even the more kind of like center conservatives interested. And then the Te Pāti Māori have come in really hard, I think, with this new, like with a lot of the, they've been building up momentum the last couple of years with some really radical policies, which we love to see. So in their justice policy, they have just announced their goal is to abolish prisons in Aotearoa by the year 2040, which is like, shoot for the stars and what is it? No, shoot for the moon, and if you miss, you still land amongst the stars.
Amongst the stars, that's right. Yeah.
But and it's like the thing is, they are while they have become a mainstream party, they're still not like anywhere near like a majority party in parliament. They are like they're getting more popular with all the polls and stuff. They're getting more and more popular, but they're not in the position to do that by themselves. But the way that our parliament works is MMP, so it's like if like you get a bunch of votes and that determines how many seats in parliament you can have. And so a lot of the time, most of the time, one of the main parties won't get enough to, like you have to get over half of them to, be the ruling party or whatever. But it's not often that someone gets enough just by themselves. So they have to form these deals with smaller parties. So at the moment, the Labour government is it's like a coalition between the Labour Party, the Greens Party, and Te Pāti Māori, and that together has meant that so Greens and Te Pāti Māori have been able to put pressure on the Labour government to do things, whatever, because Labour are pretty toothless by themselves. So we're hoping that Te Pāti Māori get enough seats in there to actually, like they're obviously not going to be able to go like, okay, we have like a couple of seats, we want prison abolition, but they can go like, okay, cool. Well, I mean, obviously prison abolition isn't about just closing the prisons tomorrow. It's about creating a society that removes this supposed necessity for prisons, so they can start kind of putting pressure on the government to, like tackle some of the social issues and stuff that lead up to it. So, yeah. So, the new policy is aimed at challenging the institutional racism that has traumatized and failed Māori communities at every level. That's part of their statement. Because Māori are super represented in prison statistics, which is like commonly a thing with colonized and Indigenous people. It's it's like over-policed and criminalized communities obviously lead to this, and we all know that like poverty is also one of the greatest kind of contributing factors to crime and all that kind of stuff. And so, there was also another awesome thing just recently. They said that if they do get into the next government, that they want to end state care for Māori children, because there have been scandals over the last couple of years where we had like a child, youth and family agency that they rebranded. They gave it a sick new Māori name and all this kind of shit like that, Oranga Tamariki, and then they just kept stealing Māori babies for like no reason. And there was like a huge expose that was like, it was all over the TV and shit. Like they were literally just taking children out of homes for like no reason at all. It was like really fucked. And this is like the kind of shit that we know has been happening, and we've talked about it for years and years. It's like, but it takes a TV expose and for people to see the actually like really pretty gratuitous footage and stuff to realize that like, like I think people have this idea in their head that they're like, oh, okay, if a child is being taken, it's from, you know, like a really terrible situation where there's like abuse and all this kind of stuff like that. But they were just taking things like, so we have this practice called like whāngai, which is like when it's like adoption within the family. Like, you know, you might give like a child to like a brother or a sister who raise it or whatever like that. So that's illegal by the state's laws or whatever. So just for that, like a child can be taken and then you'll never see them again and they just grow up in state care. And, you know, things like that. There's all kinds of other stuff. So they want to get rid of that agency and set up a separate one that's run according to kind of like Maori values and stuff like that. They also want to redistribute state funds to a separate like Maori justice system based on kind of like traditional practices, as opposed to, you know, like the kind of, I guess, you know, what you would call like the Pākehā courts, you know, which is based kind of more on, I guess, traditional ideas about justice, which I don't know if anyone is familiar with a lot of transformative justice works. A lot of, I would say, like a lot of Western transformative justice authors have always looked at the Maori model as being quite kind of like, you know, like the community, I would say the community justice kind of model is like sorry, I'm like having a hard time articulating this, but it's like that's a framework that other people have sought to emulate, I would say, is you know, where it's like justice isn't just focused on like, I guess, like punishing and imprisoning people or anything, but it's about redressing harm to the victims and making things right in the community for the victim, but also for the person that did it, so that it's like they can have a life out of this. They don't just go to jail, they don't get pushed away or whatever like that. It's like, and you know, a life where they don't reoffend, they don't do these things or whatever. And so that's part of the new justice policy. What else we got? There's all kinds of stuff like Māori legal aid services for, you know, obviously like for people that can't afford it, all this kind of stuff. Addiction services. Oh, that was a great one. They want to do drug law reform and treat it as a health issue rather than a criminal issue, and wipe previous criminal convictions for drug use and possession, which is great because the decriminalizing cannabis and stuff has been an issue here. Like that's probably going to be a thing that we hopefully get sometime soon, but there's still Maori in jail that, you know, like have been imprisoned for shit like that. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, this is, I feel like this is huge. This is the most radical policy that we've seen put forward for forever. Yeah, Maori are like just incredibly over incarcerated. What is it? Maori men, the incarceration rate peaked in 2010 at 2% of the entire population was, you know, like incarcerated, which is like just, you know, like for non-Maori, it's like 0.28%, which is like wild. And yeah, they say Maori are roughly imprisoned at about 7 times the rate of non-Maori, which is like, yeah, which is huge, especially considering our like pretty small population, not just in New Zealand, but Maori in general. I think there's only like 1 million Maori in the world, but like, you know, and 2% of them in jail, like wild. So yeah, that's it. Really looking forward to seeing how this pans out. I'm hoping they get into government. They definitely, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, the parties that I personally like, they're the ones that I kind of support. But, you know, and both of them have great policies. Both of them also have policies that I'm not too fond of. But I think based on the stance, like, that's 100% like, you know, because a lot of people always assume that I'm just going to vote for them anyway. But I'm one of those like annoying people that tries to be as strategic as possible when voting and looks at, you know, like the electorate and the representatives and how many seats and all that kind of shit. But no, but I think this is really hit a bit of a home run for me. But anyway, we've got one more story here. I would like to hear from Kira about some stuff that's been going on in Hollywood.
Yeah, so this is going to be a huge content warning. This is going to deal with sexual assault. So if you don't want to listen to that, just, just grab a drink for the next, go do something for the next 3 minutes and then come back. So Danny Masterson. Danny Masterson is an actor in Hollywood. You might be familiar with him from that 70s show. He plays Hyde. He has been sentenced in May, at the end of May 31st, he was sentenced to, he was convicted of raping 2 women. 3 women he has raped, I'm convinced, but one of them, there was a hung jury. So 2 out of 3 he was convicted of raping, drugging, and violently raping. So he was just now sentenced a few days ago, running up to a few days ago, in preparations for sentencing. A veritable who's who of Hollywood stars and other supporting people have come forward to write letters to the judge presiding over his trial, trying to plead with the judge to please don't give him a long sentence. This is, by the way, knowing that he has been convicted of forcibly, violently raping at least 2 women and drugging them prior. Knowing this, a bunch of people, and I on screen right now is the graphic I made earlier today. I worked really hard on this graphic, everyone. And because I was so upset about this story, I really wanted to make it clear that not just a list of names, but the faces of these people would be like seen. People like Mila Kunis, Ashton Kutcher, a lot of the Mastersons, so like a lot of his like brother and brothers and sisters. A lot of these people have come forward to write letters to the judge, pleading with the judge to please don't give him a long sentence. And some of the things that they've said is like, he's rejected drugs. He's encouraged me to not use drugs. He's drug free. And apparently this is supposed to be a really commending thing to say about him, even though he was convicted of drugging multiple women and raping them. All the letters insisted that he's an ethical man. He's friendly. He's jovial. He's a hard worker. And all the letters also said that he has a daughter. Please think of his daughter. If you put him in prison, his daughter won't have a father. Won't you please think of the children? I'm going to just read Giovanni Rubinski's part of his letter because it's just a demonstration of all these letters. Giovanni Rubinski, who's by the way, a Hollywood actor. I've always known Danny to be an ethical, honest person. And by the way, again, I cannot reiterate, this is after knowing he has forcibly raped multiple women after drugging them, convicted by the courts. I've always known Danny to be an ethical, honest person who lived with the highest standards in work and family. I've always known Danny to be a central figure in my peer group because of his integrity, his stance against drugs, his abhorrence of violence, and most of all, the respect he demonstrates towards women and children. He is a devoted husband and a doting father who sacrifices for his family. His wife and daughter depend on him. I know Danny's been convicted of 2 counts of forcible rape. I only ask that you consider his daughter in his sentencing. He is a good father, and he is important to her and her upbringing. This is a demonstration of the letters that you're seeing for the people on screen. This is basically their letters over and over and over again. They're talking about their personal experiences with Danny Masterson and how he's actually a really good guy, despite the fact that he actually has been confirmed by the courts as being a serial rapist. The situation is even further complicated by the presence of the Church of Scientology, for whom Danny Masterson and others are members of. If you're unfamiliar, Church of Scientology is a cult that has many high-profile figures, such as Danny Masterson, formerly Laura Prepon, also Tom Cruise, John Travolta.
There's so many. It's wild. If you look up a list, it's wild. And look at like... Yeah, even like the people putting these letters in and shit like that, it's like, oh yeah, okay, cool. There's a big, and also cannot understate just like the general influence that they have in Hollywood and LA. Like even with the LAPD, they work with, like, they hire off-duty LAPD officers to do security for them, and there's a lot of back and forth with the police unions and stuff. It's very entrenched there.
Yeah, the cops are very much entwined in this, and in fact, in the letter, I found a Substack which showed all the letters that they could get their hands on that were submitted to the judge to plead on behalf of Danny Masterson, and one of them was from a retired lieutenant of the NYPD. So yeah, the situation is further complicated by the Church of Scientology, as Tim has been alluding to. And for instance, Laura Prepon, actress from That 70s Show, also the Orange is the New Black. She's also used her status as a Scientologist, as a high-profile Scientologist, to help silence one of the victims under threat of excommunicating this victim from the victim's family and the Church of Scientology, because there's a whole thing where I'm not going to get into it. It's way too long of a spiel to explain the Church of Scientology. It's just a very, very exploitative and coercive cult. So I just wanted to close and say that this story for me is a big deal, not only because it's obviously obscene and horrific, but as both a victim of rape and also as a survivor of the Church of Scientology as a child, it's pretty meaningful. Rape culture and cults, whether it be like Scientology, QAnon, what have you, are persistent societal illnesses. And this trial and all of Masterson's supporters is just a small cross-section of that issue.
Thanks, Kira.
Yeah,
that's huge. Just real quick, we're going to mention our comrades of the show, Palestine Action.
Yes.
We got some big wins for our friends at Palestine Action in the last couple of weeks. Activists Jasmine and Lola, who were charged with obstruction of the highway following September 2022 action, in which they locked themselves within vehicles blocking the entrances of UAV Engines Limited, have been found not guilty. The ruling was based on the principle of proportionality, with the judge finding that the actions were proportionate to the crimes against humanity the pair were attempting to stop. Also, after 3 months of delays, sentencing has been handed down on 4 Palestine Action activists involved in an attempt to shut down production at the Elbit Shenstone factory, though the judge refused to hear justification defenses during trial, which might have led to their acquittal by jury. None of the 4 have been given prison time. Finally, last week, members of Palestine Action stormed the offices of IO Associates in Manchester. IO Associates is a recruiting company who one day prior announced an expansion of defense recruitment in the city for Elbit Systems. During the action, in which the protesters carried flags and a banner reading IO Associates recruiting for Elbit murderers, the company's director assaulted several people, including breaking the phone of a 14-year-old daughter of a journalist. Stay classy. Manchester Palestine Action released a statement on the action saying Manchester won't accept a recruitment agency for Israel's criminal weapons firm Elbit. People here are disgusted. IO Associates have expanded into the city. How dare they, when Israel has been exposed as an apartheid state again and again. Israel continues to massacre Palestinians, steal more land, and imprison people for defending their homes from ethnic cleansing. We won't stop until all Elbit's recruiters are kicked out of the city and Elbit is forced out of Britain for good. Based. And I'm just conscious that our guest is waiting in the wings for to come on. So real quick, just want to remind everyone, we have a Patreon. Please, please, please support us. We want to remind everyone that Red Planet is made possible, yes, only by the direct support of our viewers and listeners. We would like to expand by hiring an editor to help us produce more shareable clips and create all new content. So that's that. Please head over to patreon.com/red_planet and support us there.
All right, cool. So, yeah, thanks for all of that, Neil. We've got a guest today. We've got Nick W. Estes coming to join us to talk about a couple things. We'll get into it in a second. So, Nick's a prominent Indigenous activist from the Lower Brule Sioux Nation. He's had his work in activism and like his writing has had a huge impact on the movement, not just for Indigenous rights in America, but across the world. He's been a super prominent voice in the fight for, both the protection of the planet and Indigenous rights and, like the intersection there. So, he's coming to join us today to have a little chat about the ongoing case with Leonard Peltier and how that the bigger picture, I guess, of that, not just how it's his personal imprisonment, but what led to it, and yeah, and how it's kind of informed by the greater struggle for these Indigenous rights, environmentalism, and yeah, I would say definitely goes into the land back, land reform kind of stuff too. But yeah, thanks. I think Nick is with us now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, like I was saying in the intro, we invited you to come on to talk about a couple of things like like land back and Indigenous resistance, and I think you brought up that you thought it might be a good idea to talk about Leonard Peltier because it's coming up on his birthday, right?
Yeah, this Tuesday, September 12th, will be his 79th birthday, I believe, or 78th.
Wow.
I can't. Yes.
79.
I should know the exact year, but it's one of those two.
When was he imprisoned in?
So we say he's entering his 48th year of imprisonment, which means he's been in prison for 47 years. But we count the incarceration from the time that he was actually, detained and then extradited to the United States. So this is his 48th year of incarceration.
Yeah. So the longest standing Native prisoner in America, right?
Yeah. So he's 79. Just looked it up. Thanks, Google. But he is the longest serving political prisoner, Indigenous political prisoner, I should say. And he's one of a handful that are still, dozens that are still imprisoned from the 60s, 1970s freedom movements, from the Black Panthers, the Black Freedom Movement, as well as Indigenous and, Chicano and Latin American movements as well. Yeah. And the United States, by the way, claims it has no political prisoners.
I was always sort of familiar with his case. Just because it is quite similar to some cases we've had over here with Maori activists like Tamaiti and others like Rangi Kimura, who were imprisoned for political reasons, like basically stitched up by the state saying that, like these people are running some kind of like terrorist training camp in the, deep in the bush, and we've got to stomp that out. And, then eventually having to say like, oh shit, we don't actually have anything on these people, we just kind of got a little jumpy or whatever. So it was very similar. So I knew of his case from that, but I didn't know the depths of it, because I think that's the thing, like you kind of just get used to the idea that like you just expect that the police will come and fuck with you, and they might, like especially if it's like you're an environmental activist or some shit like that, you get used to a certain level of like, oh yeah, someone might get arrested for something, and it could be over nothing. So I knew that there was like a gunfight, and that like he shot in like self-defense and all that kind of stuff, and I just figured it was as simple as that. But in preparation for you coming on, I went through and I watched Warrior, The Life of Leonard Peltier. I watched a bunch of news segments, and it just totally opened up my mind to like how big this thing really is, and how it's and why it was such a big deal. Maybe it's to do with the way that the American media wanted to present it, that it was just a case of a one-off, a man that was in this situation, and it was just like maybe one bad day, as opposed to like the entire like context leading up to it, like the social political aspects, the ongoing harassment of that particular community, previous like literal like massacres that had happened there. Do you have a way to sum it up for people that are watching? Like, how would you explain Leonard's case to the layman, to people that aren't familiar or anything? How would you describe it?
Sure. So this case actually begins before Leonard Peltier ever steps foot in Pine Ridge. It begins before, the armed takeover of the Wounded Knee massacre site in 1973, which this year's the 50th anniversary of that takeover. And it begins, long, when the United States first started, laying claim to what is known as Lakota country, and begins to colonize it and settle it, and begins to break the Ocheti Shakoi, or the Lakota Dakota people, into smaller and smaller, groups of people, begins to divide them, creates a land base, a reservation to confine them. And then, I think a lot of people saw the Indian Wars of the 19th century as sort of the end of this kind of armed conflict between the Lakota Nation specifically and the United States government. And this culminates in the massacre at Wounded Knee of, by the 7th Cavalry. It's George Armstrong Custer's former regiment, surrounds and waylays a group of starving, horseless, mostly unarmed, Lakota ghost dancers who were on their way to surrender in Pine Ridge. They weren't even from Pine Ridge. A lot of them weren't from Pine Ridge. Most of them weren't. And they were thus subsequently massacred, some say in an act of revenge. Others, would say that it was the sort of final chapter in the closing of the frontier, so to speak. So Native history is sort of confined to the 19th century and sort of ends, right? And we see the rise of power movements in the post-war moment. This is a response to, in the specific region of South Dakota, it's a response to efforts to terminate or to relocate Native people off reservations. Globally, you see, a burgeoning anti-imperialist decolonization, anti-war movement, people using the language of national liberation to really speak about their rights beyond sort of this kind of domestic framing that we often are taught. I don't know how it's taught in Aotearoa, but here in the United States, it's taught as something like we have the civil rights movement is only kind of concerned with domestic kind of issues and
no, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of the same, like what you were saying, like there's like we have like the land wars and everything like that, and it's kind of like that kind of like the end of history kind of thing, where it's like, okay, well, that's like this stuff is like, this is resolved, and from here we're like one nation. And we learn about like Nelson Mandela, and we learn about like Martin Luther King, and like maybe sometimes they'll even teach you about Malcolm X, but they won't tell you too much about what he's saying. And it's like,
Nelson Mandela is a perfect example for this era, because he's kind of championed as this nonviolent resistor, but the reason why he was in prison is because he refused to renounce violence as a legitimate form of self-defense. People forget that they were waging an anti-apartheid struggle at that time, and there's this moralizing that happens. I think hindsight 2020, when we look back at the past and look at somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., and he's sort of the stand-in for what we know as the civil rights movement, but also on the eve of his assassination, he was one of the most unpopular people in the United States because he was speaking out against the war in Vietnam. And that was a turning point, right? We see the turning point with the Black Power movement, both domestically and, as it kind of permeated itself throughout various kind of, other countries in the world. And then you also have a burgeoning student movement. And it's interesting because the American Indian movement actually comes at the tail end of a lot of that kind of uprising. By the time Wounded Knee happens, the anti-war movement is, kind of on the decline. And this isn't necessarily because, like, I think a lot of folks look at the internal kind of contradictions within these movements and sort of look at the failure of leadership and strategy and appeal, and really forget it wasn't until after these movements were sort of on the decline that we begin to see the levels of state infiltration and repression, almost from the very beginning, right? When the Black Panthers, begin to sort of organize these community self-defense, chapters, it draws a lot of attention from the FBI, and the FBI, is under J. Edgar Hoover at this time, and running what is essentially, a political repression and policing of anyone who's kind of against the status quo. And it's important to also remember that there's sort of two elements that are combined within the policing structure and the imperialist structure of the United States. And one is anti-communism and the other is settler colonialism. And a lot of people kind of can understand the first one, but they can't really understand the second one, and how the sort of racial logics of the United States, and even its kind of imperialist push, to other countries. Everything that it had done to indigenous people, it then begins to export to the rest of the world. It begins to overthrow indigenous governments. I mean, we recognize, the overthrow of Hawaii. That was John Foster, who was the first Secretary of State to overthrow a foreign government in the United States. That's the granddaddy of John Foster Dulles, who becomes the head of the CIA. And then he's, the mastermind in the post-World War II moment of all these, CIA coups and plots, specifically kind of rooting out communist or, anything that could be labeled as communist governments throughout the world. So this is a we often, there's a critical dialectic between the domestic and foreign policy of the United States that it almost, in some ways, when it comes to indigenous people, it doesn't really quite, it's never quite one or the other. It's kind of both at the same time. And so the American Indian movement really begins here in Minneapolis in 1968. The founders were people who were part of the anti-war movement. Many of them were formerly incarcerated Native people that came from the street. They weren't intellectuals, right? But they immediately aligned themselves with Black Power, the Black Power movement. And by the 1970s, they're a national organization through a series of occupations of Bureau of Indian Affairs buildings throughout the country. And by the time, in 1972, there's kind of this, unstoppable force where they're kind of parading around the country in these caravans, going from one kind of reservation, one city to the next, really challenging the status quo and kind of introducing a kind of more militant form of struggle, one that requires self-defense.
I was struck as well by what Leonard talks about in Warrior about building up the economic kind of base of these different groups, how they would just go and they would set up somewhere, like they set up at Pine Ridge and they were like, we need some money in these communities. So we need, they started building up even just the big community gardens and all these kind of things like that. And it was like, they were just trying to get some money coming in, get people self-sufficient, because everyone was super poor there. They were saying they would get little parcels every now and then, or vouchers from the government and stuff. But in general, there was no money, there was no opportunities or anything like that. So it was very similar, to how the Black Panthers and I mean so many other groups set up where it's they start with education, they set up with some kind of basic infrastructure. Now, obviously, in a place like Pine Ridge where the government, they're not going to be handing out business grants or anything like that. So it comes down to the people, and it's it always seems that's when it becomes a problem, right? When it's this kind of self-sufficiency, when things start going right and stuff. But one thing that I also was struck by the similarities between domestic and abroad was I guess the extractive capitalist kind of element where all around Pine Ridge and the areas around, there's the land is full of valuable resources, and this is even going all the way back to Custer finding out about the literally that there's gold in the hills and all this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of people often talk about just the I guess the cultural thing of the American government or whatever fighting back against the native way of life or trying to push them out. A lot of times people will talk about it in these purely kind of romantic terms, when it's there are very material reasons why they do these things. And it's the same with I guess imperialism abroad. There's resources out there and all this kind of stuff, and it's so many parallels there. It kind of brings home the whole thing that it really is one struggle. And I wonder if this is I mean, it is kind of conspiratorial to be is this why you never learn too much in schools about the real stories of these I guess imperialist aggressions by the states and all this kind of shit? Because then you look at it and you go wow, okay, so that's what they did to the natives at Pine Ridge as well. The more kind of layers of the onion that I felt was peeled back, learning about this case, the more I saw the parallels and all over the world, not just here in Aotearoa, but also like in the way that like the way that New Zealand operates in the Pacific with other smaller Pacific nations and all these kind of things like that. It's like the only difference is that instead of, like in the States, these are like separate native nations on the same landmass. In the Pacific, it's just like everyone's on a separate island, but it's all very like pretty similar in the way that that various governments interact with them. And yeah, it definitely brings home the whole kind of like the one struggle kind of aspect, and it makes it it's really yeah, it's really interesting to see it from that side.
Another aspect, like sort of a parallel, is I think what initially draws the attention of the FBI is when the American Indian movement begins occupying what they believed were abandoned bases, but some of them were not abandoned military bases. And it becomes a sort of an extra layer of surveillance, not just by the FBI, but also military intelligence. And this is what led to the confrontation at Wounded Knee. And it became an occupation simply because the people who took over Wounded Knee couldn't leave. And the U.S. military played an active role in that. And this is something that isn't often talked about. And it was actually looking and reading the memoirs of one of the military commanders. His name was Colonel Volney Warner. Is that he's like, one of the big successes of the military operation at Wounded Knee was that nobody remembers that there was a military operation at Wounded Knee. And he even in his first assessment of the scene when he arrives, he's like, yeah, this poses no security threat to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the state of South Dakota, and national security in general. But nonetheless, much like Vietnam, why is the United States invading Vietnam, a country that is mostly peasant, based rural economy? There's no natural resources that it needs to go in and exploit. The main thrust in the same, action report that this colonel was writing at the time, he said, because if we don't do something at Wounded Knee, it could spread to other reservations. There could be other Wounded Knees. So this economic component comes in much later. At first it's a political, and then a political struggle, and becomes sort of this idea of containment. The American Indian movement was building institutions, as you say, like here in Minneapolis. One of the first, how they sort of embedded themselves in the community and got the support of the community was through jobs programs, education, cultural sort of programming, prison support, legal support, housing. They helped, create a urban housing unit. And I often think, in some ways, when we focus just on like the events of Oglala, we forget, as you pointed out, all the institutions that were being built, simultaneous to the struggle. And people tend to focus on the braids and shades and the men with guns versus understanding, like, even the day that the FBI showed up at the Jumping Bull property, at the end of June in 1975, the majority of people there were actually under the age of 20. They were mostly kids. And so most people don't realize that. And so even the popular narratives, like it was like, men with guns versus men with guns. In reality, it was like a handful of adults with a lot of children and families present, and this over kind of like compensation of force from the other end. And that begs the question. It's like, why was the federal response so quick in that moment in time? And so in some ways it was kind of it was a setup in a lot of ways, in the sense that there was an expectation for a confrontation. Internal FBI memos prove this. After Wounded Knee, the FBI felt like it was embarrassed that it didn't have the same kind of matching firepower or that it could overcompensate in terms of firepower when it was engaging specifically with the American Indian movement. But you have to remember, the FBI was just an investigative unit, right? And even when we talk about the assassinations of the Black Panthers like Fred Hampton, the FBI was actively involved, but they didn't pull the trigger. They got police to do that, right? So these are mostly like suit and tie kind of guys. but they're becoming increasingly militarized in their response to the American Indian movement. And you also have increasing economic pressure to sort of open up the West, so to speak, for resource extraction. They begin to look at, those exploratory mining for uranium. The gold industry is still booming at that time. They're trying to open coal and gas in not just the Black Hills, but in the West in general. In the western part of the United States, that's where you have the largest land-based Indian reservations, and in some cases the largest kind of concentration of native people within rural environments. So of course you're going to want to contain, a militant or armed, what this is the framing of the FBI. You're going to want to contain the militant and armed, outbreak of, native groups in these regions in that one area, because you don't want it to spread to other reservations. And this is exact. I mean, you can read the reports. Like, the military was still surveilling the American Indian movement at this time. They were looking at, in Fort Defiance down in Navajo country, because there's massive uranium, oil and gas fields. There was a group called the Coalition for Navajo Liberation that led an armed occupation of an oil field. So yeah, again, they were worried about the spread of this sort of militant, what they're framing as a militant movement, because in tandem with the American Indian movement, like, we often frame the American Indian movement as anti-tribal government, and it's not necessarily the case, because even within the Lakota tribes, AIM was supported by some tribal councils. In 1974, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe hosted the American Indian movement and formed the International Indian Treaty Council. In places like the Navajo Nation, they took this idea of like a strident kind of like third world nationalism to like, they took it very seriously and began nationalizing for all, for all, like, that's all you could really call it, is nationalizing the oil and gas reserves on their territory. And there's some divisions there, but nonetheless, it was moving, the broad consensus. The American Indian movement was sort of the vanguard of that sovereignty movement. And so it was beginning to look more and more like a threat, and threatening, the kind of the status quo in terms of like gaining access to resources, which is true, because you can look at that today. And Standing Rock, the movement at Standing Rock in 2016, there were so many, after Standing Rock, there was like actually a global, like an international sort of impact in law enforcement. The British Columbia actually formed what's called the CIRG. It's the Community Industry Response Group. It was formed, the RCMP, their kind of version of the FBI. It's like a federal police force that's tasked only with surveilling and policing native-led movements in British Columbia and Canada. And then in the United States, you have trainings. You have these local sheriffs who are policing the Standing Rock camps, going to all over the West, training local sheriff's departments and what to expect in a rural kind of like situation where native, a reservation is going to lead some kind of uprising. It's a big business, because native-led movements in Canada and the United States currently challenge a quarter of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions from both countries. Like in the specific projects, the expansion projects in terms of like oil and gas pipelines to the extractive projects, that's a lot of money. This is this isn't just like, we're not just messing around, like, this is serious business when it comes to these fossil fuel, gangsters who are literally destroying the planet. Like, they have we're hitting them hard in the checkbook, and you can kind of see that the initial kind of pressure. I would say today, and this is, something, I'll go back to the Leonard Peltier case, but today the security state is far more expansive, far more well-funded, far more, numerous and repressive in some ways than it was in the past. It's definitely bigger, right? And this is for a variety of reasons: the Green Scare, the War on Terror, the so-called War on Terror. But even today, you have the Lawani forest protectors in Atlanta, Georgia, who are trying to stop Cop City. There's over 60 of them that have been charged with RICO charges.
Yeah,
which
we were
is
talking about it just earlier, actually.
yeah, it's a federal statute for like mafia.
Yeah,
And these people are just like raising money. Like they're like the people that like I interact with are always like the nicest people, like white liberals who are just like, raising money, and we need them, God bless them. But that's who they're targeting. And guess what the date of that charge of that criminal activity is? It's May 25th, 2020, the day that the Minneapolis Police Department murdered George Floyd, because they're arguing that there's a campaign by people who are opposing the expansion of the police department. They're leading a campaign to overthrow the United States government. That's what that attorney general in Georgia is arguing, and they're trying to push that.
It seems like a common thread throughout what you're saying, and especially thank you for pointing the date out. I did not put that together. That's chilling. Is that there's the economic side of things, sure. There is like even the power side of things, which power if you can quantify it. But then there's this like ineffable just like feelings, like pride, where how dare you, this audacity.
We talked about earlier about it being like Cop City was supposed to be like this little kind of like, I guess like consolation prize for them because of the George Floyd stuff, like this was supposed to be like they're like, okay, well you put up with that, so we're going to give you this or whatever. And then the fact that there's been so much pushback on it is like a personal insult. Going back to the Pine Ridge stuff, through the documents that were leaked, there was I remember there was a point they pointed out in Warrior where the FBI changed it from a counterintelligence operation to a counterinsurgency operation, where it's like, so at first they were just like keeping an eye on these people, these groups like the American Indian movement, and just seeing what was happening, seeing what was developing there. And then there's a point where they decided like these are insurgents, like, and so basically like, this is like a terrorist group or something like that. But then when you look at it, it was the American government that was performing acts of terrorism against this small community, But I found it like really interesting when they kind of flipped the switch when they said, this is like a counterinsurgency thing. It was when they started taking measures to be self-sufficient. They started teaching people how to shoot and do all those things, which, I mean, in that kind of community, it's normal for people to have all kinds of guns. That's totally within their rights as, people that live in America to own and operate firearms, all that kind of stuff. But it's a similar thing in New Zealand with the Tamaiti and stuff. When they got arrested, it was because they started training with guns. And it's like, well, they're allowed to have guns. There's farmers that have, all over the country that have the same guns that, like are doing the exact same things, going to the forest and shooting bottles and things like that. Like that's totally normal and like even like a celebrated activity for the right kind of people. But as soon as it's the wrong kind of people, it's like, oh, this is insurgent activity. What could just be like harmless fun on a farm or whatever like that. If that kind of stuff gets added to a case file if you're not the right kind of person or whatever. It's it's pretty wild.
I mean, at the end of the day, laws are a justification for state violence. It's not actually a guideline to like how consistently the law is applied. It's just when the state wants to inflict violence on the people it oppresses, it then goes, here, do you see this? This is the reason. It's not because we're oppressive. It's because we all agreed upon this law, apparently.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important clarification to make, because we do often joke here that the law is the arbiter of all morality. Of course, that is not the case. That's not the views of Red Planet.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting case because, like you said, it was like the suit and tie guys from the FBI were the ones that rolled up, and they literally parked their cars quite a distance off and were taking pot shots at people with revolvers, and it's like, which is like, deranged behavior, and then acted like like there's interviews with the cops and some of the FBI guys talking about it, and they're talking about how they were like, oh, like this is just a couple of guys, and they were facing overwhelming odds by all these Pine Ridge guys with their rifles and all this kind of stuff, but there was no reason the cops the FBI couldn't just leave. They were never under any kind of threat where it was like they needed to stay there with their guns and do anything, protect something, do whatever. Like there was no justification for them to stay there. And further up the road as well, they had more guys. Some of the footage that I've seen shows it was the guys that were like right there, taking shots or whatever. And then there was a whole bunch more back up at the road. They, had cars parked up with more guns and everything like that. Whereas the natives at Pine Ridge had nowhere to go. They were under siege there. Like actual, like this is the kind of stuff, people look at like Waco, or they took at, like any kind of Yellowstone ranch kind of standoff bullshit or whatever like that. And they craft all these like kind of, I guess, like elaborate romantic stories about it and stuff. But then it's like, this is like the standoff to end all standoffs, like people that are like literally like backed in by the literal FBI and the cops and everything like that. And it's like they have nowhere to go, but the cops want to argue that they're the threat. They're the ones that are causing a danger to the FBI, to the cops, and all this kind of stuff like that, which is just like an absurd claim. It's wild that any of that stuff even got through the court in the first place. But then, I mean, we say that now, but then looking at these court documents, it's wild. There's like a juror that admitted to being prejudiced against natives. There was like, there was all kinds of stuff. There was like a bunch of the other guys got their charges dropped, or they got acquitted, and then they changed to a new judge who was like notorious for like being anti-native, and like all this like wild stuff where it's like that's all grounds for it to be, for the case to be thrown out, for him to be retrialed and all this kind of stuff. It's wild. They're asking for clemency as well, which isn't clemency isn't innocence. Clemency isn't like saying, like he was wrongly imprisoned. Clemency is saying he's been in prison for long enough and it's time to, let him get out and like live the rest of his life or whatever. But there's like grounds for like completely like, like he should have a right to a fair trial and all these things. And it's not like it's not unreasonable or out of line with other rulings, other cases for his team to demand that. Like how do you think the case is going at the moment? Like what do you think is like the current state of things? Because the last story I saw him on the news is that this was about like a year ago or something. I think he actually got COVID in jail, right? Like what's the state of things at the moment? Is he doing okay?
So this new sort of push, I guess this new event that's happening actually on Tuesday in Washington, D.C. is a really good sign that there's a lot of momentum around his case, various kind of legal avenues being pursued. I think one part of, the clemency application is incredibly important. But the other part of it is like looking at how, even by sort of the normative standards of justice, or like even the normative standards of the Bureau of Prisons, which keeps people in prison, he should have been paroled, like, or even like granted sort of like release. Like there's been a member of the Black Liberation Army who was released, Mutulu, because he's just so old. But that's what makes a political kind of, in his case, political, and like qualifies it as a political, him as a political prisoner. And even the United Nations, working group on torture and arbitrary detention has ruled that his case is a form of arbitrary detention, because even within the COVID standards, he's eligible for release given his pre-existing conditions. That never came through. His age, his declining health, his aneurysm, all of those things should qualify him to at least be released. And, he can be under supervised release and put into like an old folks home or retirement community in his homeland. And in fact, in Turtle Mountain, where he's actually from, the tribe has already created a a return home for him, like to provide him housing and things like that. So this is all set in place, and it really boils down to the FBI. Chris Wray, who I don't even think was alive. He wasn't even, I don't know if he was alive at the time of the shooting. Maybe he was like 8 years old. I don't know. Wrote a letter, an internal letter to, retired FBI agents and their families saying, and it was a sort of his letter to the parole board saying, the FBI family will not stand for the release of Leonard Peltier. And so this is
the FBI family. It's like an insult to them, right? Like,
well, it's also like, that's a mafia mentality, like the family. It's like it's a personal, FBI family vendetta against Leonard Peltier. And this is, in one hand, it's like absolutely reprehensible. But on the other hand, it actually reveals the attitude of this institution. Chris Wray is a Trump appointee who was kept in power by President Biden. But it also just demonstrates that, like, when January 6th happened, they like killed people. They like killed cops. But everybody went home.
Yeah. They milled around in like hotel lobbies and went to Starbucks and.
And I have my own criticism of the way that, like, these charges are coming down and everything. But it's like, it took such a long time, like, percolated on it. Those are these massive manhunts. They're not even going after the leaders. I mean, like, Trump is like facing some like election stuff, but none of the people in his inner circle is like facing anything in terms of like trying to overthrow the government. But yet they're slapping RICO charges on like kids in Georgia, right? So the RICO charges against Trump, I actually don't have anything to do with the January 6th thing. It's totally something else, which is like fascinating. So I think, like, just to kind of bring it back to the Peltier case, it's like, on one hand, all the arguments that have been made for his release have been made for the last 4 decades. Like, this is ridiculous, in terms of like the FBI, back in the 90s, marched on Washington. Like, one of the first times I think they've ever marched, or the only time they've ever marched, to protest President Clinton's like intimation that he's considering the case, right?
Yeah. I think it was like a radio interview where he's like, yeah, I'm gonna take a little look see at that.
Like Democracy Now, yeah.
Because Bill Clinton like was famous for giving clemency to heaps of people. Like, there was like celebrities, like friends of his, and all this kind of stuff. And then and it's like, I mean, there's been plenty of presidents who've given clemency for ridiculous stuff.
But then just look at like how I mean, this gets to the kind of corrupt nature of the FBI, but look at like Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger was in the same prison complex as Leonard Peltier. Whitey Bulger, there have been films made about this guy. He was an FBI informant, and probably an asset, and killed dozens and dozens of people, murdered them. And this was known by the FBI. And so what kind of people, pay a known murderer and keep them out of prison and, and free for most of their lives? Like, this is, it goes back to that FBI family, like, mentality. This is America's, like, federal gangster police force, right? They have no remorse. Like, even FBI founder J. Edgar Hoover, like, there's this whole, like, kind of attempt to rewrite and rehabilitate the FBI. Like, it's strange how the Democrats are now like the kind of like beacons of the FBI and law enforcement and whatnot. But his role in the FBI, like, they often said, oh, he's going to go after the mafia and blah 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 and organized crime. The first people he targeted were like immigrants who were communists. Like, that was his main obsession throughout his entire life, was being America's police force. Political police force.
That's like in New Zealand, we got this a lot, where they were like, after the Christchurch shooting, they were like, we need special investigative powers and all these things to clamp down on this shit. We need to get rid of these, like, white supremacists and all this kind of stuff. And like, the only time that I have heard of that they're using like these new kind of like ways to troll through data and metadata of stuff online. They're literally like only using it on like environmental activists
Right.
and, you know, shit like that. It's like they create these new powers and then use them on communists.
And yeah, and going back to January 6th, there was this internal email that was leaked from the FBI that talked about, there was a question about whether or not there was an active duty FBI agent who was participating as a civilian in the January 6th, and they couldn't confirm or deny that it was happening, nor would they confirm or deny active undercover FBI agents. But what was leaked was actually saying that regardless of anything, like any of these accusations, if they're true or not, doesn't matter, because the fact of the matter is that a good section of the FBI actually agrees with the January 6th. Like that was just like, that should have been grounds for like, you know, like we're gonna end this, like this, you know, we're gonna break apart the FBI, you know, we're gonna like put it under oversight or something like that. But no, it's like now it's just a political police force, you know, for the Biden administration against its perceived enemies, which still include us, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I did think was quite interesting was I was watching an interview with Kevin Sharp, who is Peltier's attorney at the moment, and he was like pretty candid, and he's quite an interesting figure himself. He was a federal judge in Tennessee, and so he was like nominated by Obama to the federal bench, but he actually resigned because of the mandatory minimum sentences that they brought out, and he was like, I don't agree with this, you know, I absolutely can't enforce this. So he resigned from being a judge and went back to being an attorney, and has been doing like a lot of work around like clemency since then. But the one that was quite famous was when Kim Kardashian got on, and she was arguing for clemency for a bunch of people, but particularly Chris Young, the young black dude that Kim Kardashian got clemency for. That was Kevin Sharp. That was so Leonard Peltier's attorney. He was working with her on that, but and for him, he was saying, he was like, the reason that this was successful wasn't because of me, it was because of Kim Kardashian, and that she's famous and got this attention and all this kind of stuff, which also was very similar to back in the 70s and 80s. A lot of the activists that supported Leonard were traveling around the world, going to even to like, you know, to the Soviet Union, where they were getting reported on outside of America more than they were inside of America, which is wild. You know, people were saying that there was like French newspapers that were having regular updates on him, you know, like obviously like all over like the Soviet you know, because like the official American position is that they have no political prisoners, whereas at the time they were like, those Soviets, they got 1 million political prisoners or whatever. So it was kind of this way of Soviet media like being able to very confidently say, look, America has political prisoners.
You know, I think it's important to point out that it's not like you know, Soviet citizens are just like brainwashed into this thing, and I think that's how it gets like kind of portrayed. But there's 17.5 million people who, like, it's not like everyone was like from Moscow or St. Peter, whatever, Leningrad. It was like people who were in the far reaches in the eastern part of the countries that were writing these letters because they, you know, they felt compelled by, like, you know, not just like Leonard Peltier's case, but the way that like Native people were treated by the United States. And it's also worth pointing out that even like in the Eastern Bloc, there were a lot of like for better or worse, there were a lot of hobbyist groups that were participating, you know, and they became kind of the locus of a lot of like political support for the indigenous movement as it was going to the United Nations. But also, you know, at that time, it's like, I think this is the kind of conceit of settler colonial governments, like, is that we're supposed to be aligned with the people who have genocided us, and we're not allowed to either make friends or choose, you know, like, we don't want to make like why are we being dragged into you know, these kind of like great power wars? And I think I was talking to a Kanaka Maoli, a friend of mine, for a show that's premiering tomorrow on the Maui fires, and she says, you know, like, we never, like, Kanaka Maoli people aren't like united in saying China's our enemy. Like, why should we have to why should we have to align ourselves with American empire? when it's like literally colonizing our lands. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that's what actually turns a lot of people off to Indigenous politics, is that like, if we're true about our like international relations, and our power, we have to be non-aligned with this kind of imperialist system. And like, we don't, like, nobody's advocating for war. Nobody's like saying, oh, we're going to support everything this country does or that country does. But the reality is that if you're not going to support like the liberation of people at home, then we have every right to go and to petition other nations. Imagine Palestinians were just tasked with the goal of trying to convince everyday Israeli settlers that they're humans. It's an absurd notion.
And anything short of that is somehow like some sort of like ethical, moral, like bad. Like,
Yeah.
How dare you seek out? That is a perfect analogy, by the way. That's amazing.
It's the same as like with like Vietnam and any number of these kind of like imperialist wars. When there was
it's also what happened in Rhodesia. It's like,
yeah.
Hello, like, why would the people who are literally like disenfranchised go to the white supremacist settler government that literally has disenfranchised them, and ask, like, oh, what are we supposed to do? Like, hug the murder out of you? What are you supposed to do in that situation? What was Nelson Mandela supposed to do when he was in prison? Like, just beg for forgiveness, cry on the shoulder of the man who stole your land? Like, what is, like, that's the most absurd form of politics. Even settlers don't do that. Like
over here there have been like these pushes for Maori to get involved, and like there have been like deliberate like army recruitment efforts targeting Maori and Pacifica communities, being like, this is the way that you get a seat at the table, basically. Like, this is a way that you become like just as good as them or whatever. And there's obviously always been like movements of conscientious objectors, and they've always become political prisoners. Like in Vietnam, even going all the way back to World War I and II, there was like huge amounts. There was like entire tribes that objected and were like like imprisoned. There was like, I mean, a lot of people don't know that was really a thing in Aotearoa, where particularly Waikato Tainui were mass imprisoned for not going to war, and a lot of them in chains built like some cities down south, like Dunedin and stuff. Like, a lot of like the streets and infrastructure were built by like what like no one wants to call slaves, like political prisoners, Maori. And that's like that's within like my like my grandfather's generation. It's like there's people were alive. Like, it's like, this is the recent history. And then and then Vietnam comes around and they're like, hey guys, want to go again? And it's like, there's a lot of Maori poetry from particularly around the Vietnam era about these guys like going off over there and then like meeting or seeing Vietnamese people, meeting them and being like, damn, like, I've got more in common with this guy than I've got with this other guy in the uniform next to me. Like, my relation to everything, from the land to my relation to this empire and everything like that. Why am I fighting this guy? And a lot of them got like really radicalized. People that were uninvolved in politics or anything, a lot of them came back from Vietnam and were like radical Maori separatists after that. So yeah, I think it is interesting how these like these parallels that we were like talking about earlier keep popping up. But yeah, so we should actually talk a little bit more maybe about Leonard's case. So so this Tuesday they're trying to get clemency from President Biden. This is like like how many presidents have been petitioned for clemency at this point. But I think like it's like with every year, I think it is kind of getting more important now, because he's an old guy, and it's even, and in prison it's kind of life expectancy isn't very high for someone locked up, especially someone that has like pre-existing conditions and has COVID and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of more there's like a little bit more pressure.
Yeah, I'm really pessimistic and skeptical of the Democratic Party, just because there was the same kind of push under Obama, and actually, Leonard Peltier's son Waha died in the hotel room next to me when we were lobbying for his freedom in 2016 after Standing Rock. Like, it was on the national radar. Like, so we've done all this before, and so they're so cruel to him that they would, let his children die petitioning for his own freedom. Like, I have no respect for them. I just, be honest with you, I have no respect for them because they've had 47 years to shred a sliver of humanity. And that's all we're asking is a sliver of humanity. We're not, you can go back to being, a corrupt politician. I don't care. But I mean, I do care, but I'm just trying to be rhetorical here. So I don't put my faith in the system, but what I will say is there's a lot of groundswell support for this case. It's the grassroots people. We see, Kevin Sharp is great. I know him personally. He's a really, I believe he's a sincere dude. It's not a big thing to step down from the federal bench. Most people, like, that's not something you do, so I am moved by his moral conviction, but it's really the grassroots people, that having gone to the memorials, having seen this, work over time, that's where the true kind of spirit, and if he is released, if he is, gets his freedom, it's the victory of those people who've kept it alive for 48 years. It's not the people who decided one day that they're under some kind of political pressure to do this, system. It's like you have every minute of your life to choose humanity. You have every minute, every second of your life to choose humanity, and when you deny it, like that's a thing, but when you accept it, or when you live it and you embrace it and you work for the collective good, that should be recognized and celebrated first and foremost, not those who have repressed it, both in themselves and in others. And I always bring that up because we had a rally here at Cedar Park, where the Little Earth neighborhood is, and there's just so many young people. Actually, for the first time for the first time I've ever seen in this, working this campaign for the last decade, there were more young people than there were older people, and that to me is amazing. And it's a qualitative shift, and because it's just like people are so aware of what's happening with Standing Rock and them going after this generation of water protectors. People just like have enough, like, because there is no alternative. Like, we're literally seeing the future destroyed before our eyes, and the inability and the refusal to create comprehensive, climate policy, like even just like of a milquetoast liberal kind, like that are in the Paris agreements. Like, we're falling short of all of that. And so I think young people are just like fed up. There's like, and to me, that is powerful that they're creating a movement again, not again, there always has been there, but around this particular issue. And so that's where I'm hopeful, and I haven't seen that before. And so we have a different momentum. And I think that's going to be, I hope that's going to be the change, the shift that's necessary to push this, to completion.
One of the biggest things we say on Red Planet is that when we have really bad news, the hope that you can take from that is that it will just radicalize more people. And as you said, like, you've seen that already happening. And how do you feel about like that sort of, in terms of bolstering the land back movement as a whole? I
think that's kind of like they're both, I think, what do you call it? Like, there's a technical term where it's like they're mutually constitutive, I think is what people say.
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
In terms of like, they've always kind of been the same, right? Like the Red Power movement, especially as it came to Lakota country, began with Lakota grandmothers decided to occupy Mount Rushmore. And it wasn't to like necessarily take back Mount Rushmore at that time, even though it became that later on. But it was because the U.S. military had taken land from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and turned it into a bombing range, and they wanted that land back. And then it was like, yeah, and actually the Black Hills too, where Mount Rushmore is, this shrine of white supremacy. And that was what led, that was in 1970. That's what led, to the American Indian movement coming into that region. So it was all tied together. And then I think we often think, I think wrongly, that the American Indian movement just kind of like vanished from the face of the earth, after the shootout at Oglala. But like, on the other side of the reservation, there was like a functioning survival school. There's community projects going on. That all continued. That evolved into Women of All Red Nations, really taking up the leadership roles, especially when a lot of the men were put into prison. But also to say that like the FBI and the media only really cared about women's leadership, or excuse me, men's leadership. They didn't see women as leaders. And I was talking to Madonna Thunderhawk, and she says, the American Indian movement is a movement of families. And it is, it's true. Like it goes down to that Tioshbai system, the system of the family, not in this kind of like heteronormative, whatever, Western liberal sense of the nuclear family. It's like, it means that providing for all the needs, like everyone went to all of the American Indian movement occupations. It wasn't like just dudes in their 30s showing up. It was like everyone, grandmas, grandpas, aunts, uncles, children, grandchildren, they all showed up because that's how they roll. That's what made the American Indian movement kind of different from these other kind of political movements. So when you're talking about like land back in the 1980s, these same families, they didn't disappear. They didn't like, they didn't just like crumble under the state repression. I think it's a popular narrative, like, oh, after FBI came in, they just kind of like threw in the towel. And it's like, no, you just weren't paying attention to the work that the women continued doing and these families continued doing. They led a coalition of native and non-native environmentalists to stop uranium mining in the Black Hills and to return the Black Hills back to the Lakota Nation. And you had like labor unions who were involved in this, who were like adopting treaties, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty within their labor constitutions, to say like this is actually protecting labor rights because it has inbuilt environmental protections. So therefore it's like a workers' struggle. And also like we have like native people on our unions, so it was like a really amazing moment. And it showed like how expansive, I guess, the environmental movement could be, and anti-colonial, right? And it won. They stopped uranium mining, right? And that's huge. That's in the 1980s. And the land back movement just like didn't, again, throw in the towel and stop. It's like, we understand this as a generational movement. And so I think in the sense of like Peltier, he just is somebody, they want to keep that movement in prison, right? They want to imprison it and criminalize it. And then they create all these kind of rumors about him and about the movement that are simply untrue, like that it was like this misogynistic, like male-led movement. Then how do you explain, the continuance of survival schools that were pretty much run just by Native women? How do you explain the continuance of the housing programs, the legal aid programs? How do you explain, this Black Hills Alliance that brought together diverse kind of sectors of society to actually stop some of the biggest and most notorious like polluters in the world? Like, how do you explain that? It doesn't add up. And in fact, I think when we look back and we say like, oh, well, the FBI won and like the aim just kind of like is confined to the dustbin of history, we're kind of adopting this kind of like misogynistic, patriarchal like worldview. And also like it also ignores how the FBI attempted to use families and women as weapons. They threatened to take the children away from people, or they threatened the children who were involved at the shootout from separation of their families, or they turned women into, informants by threatening to take away their children and exploiting them. Like this is all proven through like just Peltier's case. Or they end up being involved in some way or covering up the murder of all these people. So there's like, by the time like Peltier is going to trial, there's well over 50 unsolved murders and and countless other rapes and beatings on Pine Ridge. It's like a low-level dirty war. And the FBI is like the main law enforcement that's supposed to track all those things. Those are considered major crimes on Indian reservations, and that goes to the authority of the FBI, but they weren't there to do that. There's an overabundance of them on the reservation, like 30 plus, more than there ever had been historically. But why is it that there's, you know, more murders, more rapes, more beatings, more violence? Like it doesn't add up, and it's because they weren't there to stop those things. They were there to actually prevent us in some ways. I don't think maybe they consciously knew this. I don't think they were ideologically aligned, like so much in terms of like, we're going to stop the land back movement, but that was essentially their function, right?
Yeah. There was a FBI guy that was interviewed. I think it was in Warrior. I watched a couple of documentaries about it, and he said that he thought of himself as a crusader, and that he was kind of like fighting this crusade of like all that was good and right in the American way. And he's like, and I suppose that attitude made it like permissible for me to do things that I probably wouldn't do to other people, or, you know, basically saying that he had this like kind of us and them attitude where he was like this noble crusader and everyone else was just standing in the way of, you know, peace and justice or whatever like that. So that he did terrible things to enforce this, and he knows that he did it. And it's like, it's fucking wild to watch this guy. This is like a documentary from the early 90s, and he's just like saying these things, just admitting that he was basically like this holy American race warrior, basically.
Yeah. Did you hear the Republican guy as well, like from Wisconsin or whatever, in that Warrior documentary? And he was talking about like the assimilation, like the forced assimilation of natives, like just brazenly being like, oh no, we need to get them off the reservations and get them into society, otherwise they'll stay on the reservations with the bad guys and get worse and worse. It just like so vile. I mean, obviously, you know, like Republicans are going to be very open about their racism.
Yeah,
I mean, but it's just like so obviously and blatantly, and they don't give a fuck. Like, yeah, just absolutely vile. Yeah,
It's almost like the American colonialism is like a cult. Like I don't use that. I know that sounds like ha ha ha, but like honestly,
the whole like manifest destiny ideology and stuff is very like, you know, very deranged and cult like, and, you know, like definitely has religious kind of aspects to it, I would say. But yeah, but it's wild to see how, you know, and like, you know, like the people that were going in and like policing these communities from the outside were not like thinking like, oh, hey, this is, you know, like this is a community of people. And, you know, like the idea that you know, like this idea of like the police or like, you know, like the FBI or whatever, like being separate from the community as opposed to, you know, part of it is like, yeah, I mean, I think like that's like that's just a really terrible thing about police mentality in anyway. But yeah, I think it's like, you know, normally they're thinking that way about, you know, like a neighborhood that they don't come from or whatever like that, or like a part of town that they're policing but they don't live there. But when you take like the, I guess like the kind of you know, like the ideological kind of considerations of it being like, you know, like a native reservation and then these people being settlers, I think it's just like really kind of turns the heat up a lot on the what is it, the I don't know, the racism dial or something, you know, like
turning up the racism dial.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be a surprise, because like this is what, like 4 years after COINTELPRO has been exposed, you know, like this is happening during the Church Commission. In fact, the American Indian movement was supposed to be sort of part of the investigation, like the FBI's surveillance of the American Indian movement. And after, like several days after the shootout in Oglala, like the Church Commission decides not to, just because it's still considered an ongoing investigation. So we don't even actually know, like we don't know the extent, you know, that there's this level of surveillance, you know. But, you know, one thing that's worth pointing out is that in Standing Rock, the informant, the FBI informant, was actually the nephew of one of the former BIA officers who was tasked with policing the American Indian movement. and he slept with and had an intimate relationship with Red Fawn Fallis, who was actually the daughter of an FBI or of an American Indian Movement member who was also under surveillance by the FBI. So this is like generational, stuff. This isn't like, again, it goes back to the FBI family vendetta thing. It's like, this is like this, the FBI is still using and abusing Native women, right? 100%. And so it's now tasked, thanks to Daddy Trump, with investigating these unsolved murder missing Indigenous women cases. And they created the MMIP, Murder Missing Indigenous Persons Unit, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and federal law enforcement. But yet it has actually helped perpetuate that violence against Native women, and has actively ignored investigating a lot of these murders and deaths, but now is tasked and funded to do that, right? And in Pine Ridge, the FBI, the Oglala Sioux tribe, the council actually tried to sue the FBI, but couldn't, because we're in a colonial relationship with the United States. It could only sue the BIA. So it sued the BIA for like this, this lack of enforcement of, like investigating these unsolved murders and things like that. So the irony is, like, these aren't things that are like confined to some like remote regions of history or geographies in the United States. They have deep implications in the continued like colonial relationship of Native people in this country with the federal government. And so this actually plays out in like how land back is supposed to work too. And so it's a really complicated framework. But I will say this: I believe, and maybe I'm overly optimistic. I'm pessimistic about a lot of things. I'm a crotchety old leftist. I'm getting that way, but I'm optimistic, and I'm always optimistic that, given the truth, because we live in a heavily, I don't even say propagandized, and not even just misinformed, but under-educated and lied to kind of population, that, given the facts of these cases, and not just Leonard Peltier but others, like, given just the information, I think to average people, they would say, wow, this is a travesty, this is a crime. Like, and that's really like what, at the end of the day, I think, not just Leonard, I don't want to speak on behalf of Leonard Peltier, but having been involved in this campaign for a decade, it's something that like we strive to do, just give people the basic facts. Here's the primary documents. You can read for yourself what the FBI has said, make up your own mind, but just know that this is part of an ongoing history. It didn't end in once he was convicted in the late 70s. Didn't end with that. It still continues today. And so I think just providing that information, I think anyone would be upset that, like, not only do Native people not have autonomy and control of their own destinies, but you, as the American population, whose interests are supposed to be looked after by these institutions, also don't have autonomy and control of your own destinies. Because it's I think that's the real kind of crux of this, and this is where I think there are alliances, and have been alliances, with other groups, not just when I say average, I'm not saying like the average like white American, like, cool, but like I'm speaking of other groups who've experienced oppression, and like, even just if you are white and you are poor, like there's some common ground here. And I think that's the biggest fear, is that these institutions, what they tell people they actually do isn't what they actually do, and they're protecting a class of people versus, because that's the theory of the state, right? Whether it's a colonial state or not a colonial state, the theory of the state is that police, military, they protect a certain class interest, right? And that's really what's at stake here, is that everyone has to benefit. The majority of people in this country and around the world have to benefit by telling the truth, right? And again, going back to just being human and like having that common humanity. And if that is such a threat, like the democratization of the economy, the democratization of land use, because we understand historically Indigenous people, like there's a history of chattel slavery in this country. People, like Black people, have been dispossessed of land ownership. Like, we have to address those things. but we're not going to have a honest conversation if we're still like lying to ourselves and perpetuating lies that somehow people who are fighting for equal redistribution of things are the enemy. Like that's like who in their right mind would trust a rich person who's accumulated like wealth on the backs of so many other people? So like that's, I think, really at the end of the day, that's the so-called threat, right? The Indian problem, as we understand it in the 21st century. Because when we look at the water protector and the water protector movement, it's not like native people out there like claiming like we have the, like we monopolize the relationship to water. It's like, no, like anybody try not drinking water for once, or like try drinking dirty water for once. Like it doesn't matter what color your skin is or who you are, like we all need water. That's a universal aspiration. But we understand that there are certain people in this country and throughout the world who have a disproportionate like access to clean water, and their lives are often threatened because their livelihoods are often threatened because their water and access to those very things we need to live are sacrificed for profit. So that is a common human, like that's a universal, like it's in the, you know, let's do away with this postmodern bullshit and like actually listen to what water protectors and indigenous people are are saying. They're speaking to everybody. This, you know, they're non-indigenous water protectors, for better or worse. You know, we had the Burning Man people too, but but you get what I'm saying. It's like being a water protector, as I understood it and was taught, it was like grounded in indigenous values, yes, but also it wasn't a indigenous exclusive like political identity or cultural or whatever you want to call it, social identity. It was an act, right, to protect something for the benefit of everyone. And to me, that could be a threat, because it's encouraging, like it's not a political party, it's not like an organized political, I mean, it will kind of is, but anybody could be a water protector, you know, anyone could subscribe to those values. And so we have to, like, you know, the view of those in power is to criminalize, to mock it, to degrade it, to imprison it, right? To like get, you know, your local priests who are raising money, you know, your local religious group that is raising money and slap RICO charges on them, right? That's where we're at. Like, we're beyond the pale now.
when you explain to any normal person, like it's so extreme, you know? And it's like, I feel like it's always like the activists and stuff are framed as being the extremists and having the extreme views and stuff. And it's just like, no, like this is the least extreme thing in the, you know, to think that like everyone should have access to water, everyone should have access to food and education. Like these are not extreme positions whatsoever. Presented to any reasonable person, like what objections could you have to those, right?
Also, with regards to what you're saying about how this isn't like putting away with like the postmodern stuff, like you said, and just focusing on the fact that like these are just people that are like, hey, other people, we need water to drink, right? Like, let's all care about this. It makes me think like there's no person who's like, I'm an ally to people that need water. I do my ally. There's no allyship like that. It's like
somehow I don't need water. Yeah.
I
don't need water. But
on behalf of those
really
who need water,
you
know, none of that shit.
There's I think there's
always
there's always like this thing that I personally have bumped into a couple times, and it comes from critics and allies as well, when talking about like indigenous movements, particularly with regards to like land and natural resources and stuff. There's this thing where even like well-meaning allies will be like, no, they need the water or the land because, you know, and they'll retreat to these kind of like really kind of new agey kind of metaphysical arguments and stuff. But I feel like all of the groups that I have personally been involved with or, you know, communicated with, it's like, yeah, okay, cool. Like in kind of like Maori tradition, there is like a different spiritual relationship with land and water, all those kind of things like that. But like the primary argument has always been material, where it's like people need land, they need water, they need all these things just to survive and to thrive. And it's like the commodification of land while kind of depriving one group in particular of it is like probably one of the biggest factors that we have that causes kind of like Maori poverty in New Zealand, you know, like this kind of historic deprivation at the same time is like commodifying every kind of corner, every chunk of land in New Zealand for like, you know, creating like the dairy industry, creating the forestry industry and all this kind of stuff like that. These industries that built New Zealand as opposed to, you know, like Aotearoa or whatever. The metaphysical stuff is just like not like it's almost like kind of like, yeah, it's important to a lot of people or whatever, but it's like it's really neither here nor there when you really get down to the brass tacks. The main thing is just like securing the land, occupying the land, all these things like that. And it doesn't matter like where you're coming from, what you believe, or you know what any of that kind of stuff like that. It's just like, just, you know, you can get involved, like you said, like anyone can be a water protector. If you support it, just go support it. You don't need to call up your one Maori friend and be like, hey, do you think it's okay if I go to this thing? Like, just go. Like, if you support it, just go. Just be about it.
Well, I think there's just like this idea of attrition within settler kind of I guess Western mentality, where it's like somehow it's like a one-to-one. Always has to be like some kind of one-to-one conversion. But I also always take umbrage with the idea that somehow like indigenous spirituality is somehow like a abhorrent, when a lot of Western traditions base their like law, their common law, off of like blatantly Christian like values and belief systems. Like there's like the whole like idea of like the Cartesian view of nature. Like, so all that stuff is already underlying. Even if you are an atheist, then if you are an atheist, then don't prescribe to any like Western legal system because it has its origins. You know, like that's not like, that's actually an absurd proposition. I would never tell anybody to do that. But why is there's always this kind of like double standard when it comes to us? And it's because it's an innate or sort of a knee-jerk anti-indigenous or like notion of savagery, right? Like somehow,
yeah, absolutely. Like, oh, they're not gonna make me eat someone, are they? Like, relax, we're not Catholic.
Yeah. It also assumes that there's somehow like not a not just a spiritual basis, but I mean just like there was not like a basis of law, like or that somehow these like indigenous societies were like lawless, you know, and like that's also it's an absurd notion. And I think especially coming from the left and like from a socialist position, it actually makes more sense to like build on what's already there. Like you know, you have a whole tradition of like, you know, Meriategi, who was a Peruvian socialist who saw indigenous societies as a sort of root of an American socialism. And in fact, if you go to other like countries, you look at their socialist movement. I always bring this up because it's hilarious. I went to Brazil with some of my white American friends, comrades. They're really great friends of mine. But there was this kind of like a call by a lot of the Brazilian like communists to like and left organizations to do like singing and dancing, like because that's how they like roll. There's like this whole cultural aspect of it. The MST, the landless workers movement, is tied to the Catholic Church. So there's a deep kind of like foundation of a spiritual tradition within the left, and especially in a place like Brazil. And they were like unable to like relate in that way. And if you go to a meeting in like a leftist meeting in the United States, it's like one of the most sterile. It can be sterile, not always, but it can be sterile. And then there's this weird like, oh, well, we don't want to do this indigenous stuff. Like we don't understand, but what people don't realize. And I think somebody mentioned this earlier about how like, yeah, the FBI there's like a pride, there's like a sense of, like there's a psychological aspect to it. Well, actually, like revolutionary movements and movements in general also need that too. There's always this intangible element. That's like the role of culture, right? When Amilcar Cabral was talking about return to the source, it was a socio-political and economic kind of argument that it was making, that like colonized people have been knocked off of their rightful path towards development according to their own needs and values. But at the same time, the culture that if you believe it in a Marxian sense, like there's base and superstructure. It's kind of a simple way of saying it, but like the base is, the economic structure, which is for Native people, Indigenous people in this context would be non-capitalist. And out of it arises culture, our language, our spirituality, our belief systems, how we organize, our family structures and things like that, kinship. That is all organized from an economic base, or is reflective of an economic base. They may have destroyed our non-capitalist way of living, but they haven't destroyed our culture. And so why wouldn't you use that tool? If it arises from a non-capitalist origin, why wouldn't you use that tool to your advantage? Because it's the remnant of a non-capitalist. I wouldn't say it's anti-capitalist, but it's a remnant of a non-capitalist kind of like a society. And you can use that to organize maybe towards a higher conscious around anti-capitalism and possibly, socialism. But I think this is, when you look at like even Bolivia and the movement towards socialism and plurinationalism, there's a psychological kind of element to the destruction of the Wapala. Like it's not just the burning of a flag, it's the burning of a religious, spiritual, symbol that means something. It represents like a psychological kind of like the masses of, the psychology of the masses in terms of for maybe a brief moment of time felt a level of equality or a sense of equality with their former colonial masters, right? And having that overthrown through a coup, had a psychological effect, but it was also the way they mobilized to create or to implement an experiment within a state system, arguably not without its own faults, but nonetheless, like moving towards something, right? And I think that's what's important about it. Like, I don't want to have a soulless movement. I don't like, that's not what inspires people. That's why you need art. That's why you need music. That's why you need spirituality, I would argue. Give me a scientific explanation of love? You're going to just tell me it's chemicals? Like, come on.
Love exists. I know it exists because I feel it.
Yeah.
I think this is a perfect time to jump into questions. We have a ton.
Oh boy.
So
Nick, don't feel like you have to give essay length answers to all of these. You could just say yes or no, or you whatever. But yeah, luckily the first one that we have isn't actually a question. It's just from one of our chatters. Criterion X says, not so much a question, but I wanted to say thank you to Nick for changing my life for the better. Seeing him speak on my campus years ago changed me, and his work pushed me to keep fighting for a better world.
Right on. That's
awesome.
But next we have an actual question from Catgirl Steph. She says, this is basically the homework, but are there orgs or causes that we as a largely online/international audience can help with?
Well, I'd obviously say if you can support our work at the Red Nation. We have a media arm called Red Media. And if you're not a Patreon subscriber, please become one. It's like $2 a month. It actually goes a long way. We're doing a freedom to read program with people who are incarcerated, specifically Native people who are incarcerated, to get them books that they need, but also like to get Native authored books in the hands of children. And it's not like all like super radical political stuff. It's just like, it's stuff that, again, going back to that cultural thing, we believe this is a broad front kind of issue. So I would say first and foremost, support what we're doing. But I also would just tell you, wherever you are in the world, there is somebody who's struggling. There is groups that are struggling. And, it's sometimes we connect through these mediums, which are really important, but also it's also important to like do that kind of like in-person kind of, struggle sessions, even if it's just a reading group. Reading groups often, they could evolve into a political movement, but I would always just recommend people, in their own neighborhoods, in their own, watch a movie together, discuss it, like do it with your own family, start with your family, start with your friends, start with your coworker. Like you could, there's always a space for it.
And Nick, just to confirm, is that patreon.com/Red Media PR?
Yes.
Cool.
We've got one here from Peanut Butter Princess, who is asking, are there other Indigenous people or activists who are imprisoned under similar conditions?
There are. I was given a name, but I'm not comfortable releasing it right now, just because they're like detained and like it's a strange legal situation. But it's actually, I've been working with this group called the Tactical Media Team, and we've been trying to actually create a list of Indigenous political prisoners that we can have people write to and support. That's not complete yet. It's something that we're actually working on right now, because we were talking about this. We were meeting, and like, you know, this Leonard Peltier caravan is going, and we were like, hey, we should, you know, like, there's other like Leonard Peltiers, you know, people are trying to create Leonard Peltiers, and should create a list. So that's in the works right now. There's a group called the Water Protector Legal Collective. Check them out. They do a lot of work with incarcerated people, specifically around like, you know, anti-extractive protests, or even just in general. They've been really great, and they might have more resources on that right now.
And I think their website is waterprotectorlegal.org.
This is from Risk Inverse. In your book, Our History is the Future, you end with, quote, "For the earth to live, capitalism must die," end quote. From your perspective, what can we do as individuals, and what can we do to organize to bring this about?
I personally take umbrage with this question, because this is what our whole show is about. Have you not been paying attention? A bit of a big question for Nick, but answer it as best as you can.
Nick, can you fix it?
I mean, the answer is in the question is organize. Like, that's what we need in this moment more than ever, is organize. I really am, like, again, like, I'm pessimistic that the current mechanisms in place can actually save the future of this planet, like, for at least human life, the way that we know it today. And that, I don't know what to say. I don't want to go down that dark path, but organize. We need that, you know, we need that more than ever.
The next one is from the Cheat 1312. Do you have any book recommendations about the land back movement?
I don't, because there isn't like other than like The Red Deal, if you haven't read it, because we do talk about land back. There are various kind of like perspectives on that, but I would say that we tried to kind of create a synthetic approach to it, in terms of like thinking of it from a broad perspective, looking at North America. But I mean, again, that, like, you know, there's different kind of movements, and I can't give you like a good like book that like specifically covers it. There was a land back magazine that was published through NDN Collective. It's on hiatus, but I think they're gonna pick up another issue. It was a limited run, sadly, but there's some cool, like, it was like global perspectives, you know, they had like Palestinians and like people from all over the world, so that was super cool.
Cool. And so what's next? Yucca Mountain Johnny says, occupations bring awareness but have a finite lifespan. What are the most critical actions that should be taken in parallel with an occupation to help ensure that any gains of the occupation persist after it ends?
I think one element that I've seen in my own work that I've been trying to work more on, and have been inspired by other efforts to do this, but oftentimes occupations result in the confrontation of two kind of forces. Like, if you remove the police for a second, it's between like extractive industry workers and land defenders. And the majority of those extractive workers are in unions. And we need to educate unions, because these unions also have Indigenous members too. It's not like there's like unions are non-Indigenous, but to educate people that when they are going to these Indigenous-led blockades, that they're crossing a picket line. And we need to build working class solidarity to educate union members that they shouldn't be crossing a picket line. You know, this is a community that set up a picket line to defend their livelihood for a specific reason, and you need to learn why, you know, but also to recognize that you have Indigenous union members, you know. And so I think that's the biggest tension right now. I mean, there's the whole thing about the police. That puts us in a different realm than just like looking to NGOs all the time for support and guidance. I think they do okay work, but that's not a movement, right? That's just an NGO. And so understanding that these movements need a ground game too in large urban centers, not just on the ground and you know, directly challenging pipelines and things like that. That's important, but there should be multiple sites, and we should also take the fight to the polluters and not just like go out in these rural, like geographically isolated areas, but also understand that these places, there's like, you know, headquarters, they have workers that, you know, like there's a whole element to this that we have to understand. And I think that's, you know, that's we're really far behind on that, but I think that's where I would like to see this. So if you're in a union, you know, get on this.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, so we got one more here. Oh, it's another one from Peanut Butter Princess, who is asking, what kind of sites or accounts are recommended for keeping informed about news with regard to land back and Native movements? Is it recommended as a white person to join Native organizations with the goal of listening and learning? And are there recommended ones to join?
There are a lot of different sources. I read all kinds of different things. Like I still use RSS feeds. I don't know if anyone knows what that is.
Yeah. I feel like those need to make a comeback. We need to just like destroy Twitter for good.
At this point, Twitter's fucked, and Google is also really bad at information. So
you know, so like I look at a lot of different things. I mean, I look at like I mean, I just like I'm in an organization, so we get this information. So it's like you're automatically like subscribed. We used to have kind of a news channel that we would post publicly, but we haven't, you know, we've been kind of lax on that because we were going through some internal restructuring. It's taken a lot of time and energy away from the kind of more media stuff, but we used to, and we're hoping to get back to this kind of more public facing media approach and highlighting movements and doing analysis. We used to do newsletters. I think we're trying to move back to those as well, to kind of like give a comprehensive and synthesis of like the movements that are going on. But you know, like I follow like I guess Indian Collective. I follow like, I mean, there's just like the normie kind of news sites like indians.com. Indian Country Today is pretty good for the most part, just like general kind of native stuff. But yeah, it's a really good question.
I think Indian Country Today had a couple good pieces on Leonard's case that I had read through just last night. But
Native News Online does a lot of covers a lot of like movement stuff too. So I recommend those. I'm trying to think of what else. There's other ones. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. It's like asking a fish to describe water.
That's cool. That's heaps. Awesome, cool. Well, yeah, I think that wraps up all the questions that we've got. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or plug or anything while we still got you?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head other than just, you know, if you are in the United States, you know, go to, I think it's the Indian Collective website. There's a lot of campaign material about the Leonard Peltier work and how you can actually support. There's also whoisleonardpeltier.info that has a lot of resources on his case and how to write him. Please write him, you know, write your political prisoners. You know, always like remember that the movement is in all of us. It's not just like, you know, this individual or this spokesperson. So we all have a part to play. And again, just get out there and organize. Like we really, really need it. Like all of us do. I don't care if you're white or whatever. Like the whole thing, like there's a question about, can a white person do this? It's like like there are spaces you can organize. Like it, you know, follow Native movements, support them. That's cool, but like, you know, like I don't like this whole thing about like it, like creating this positivist identity around like being white and whatnot. But we do need our own spaces at the same time. So like, you're an adult, you can navigate that. Like we're all human, you know.
Yeah. I found like in a lot of spaces, it's generally pretty obvious, and I found like with Maori stuff, it's like it's usually pretty clear, you know, like, or someone will be like, hey, this is just for you know,
Yeah.
like people that are mana whenua from this area, like people that, kind of have like a tribal kind of like interest in this area, whatever, like that. But usually it's like, oh, but if allies are interested, you can check out this or something else,
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, I've never particularly found that there was like any like that there was too much kind of like obscurity there. But yeah, but I've just been really lucky, like I think there's and it's never I don't know, it's like I don't think it's rude to ask and be like, hey, look,
Yeah.
I'm an ally. I really love what you're doing. I support your work. Is it cool if I come along and check it out? Like if not, that's fine, whatever. And I
Yeah.
think that like most, yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable kind of pretty reasonable conversation to have. Um, all right, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for coming along. Thanks for joining us and talking about all this stuff and answering all these good questions.
Hang on, Tim. There is one thing, but I
Oh,
think that Nick has probably already sort of touched on this already. I don't suppose you have any particular ideas of homework other than what you've already suggested?
Oh man, I do that for a living, so
Maybe like we could tell our chatters to watch the Leonard Peltier
Oh, yeah, yeah.
documentary.
yeah. I would also recommend you read The Red Deal. That really gives our political position on a lot of these things. Oh, the other thing that I think y'all should read that I've always just really enjoyed is the 2010 Cochabamba Accords. Find those online. Those are just really good. It's better than a Green New Deal. It's indigenous, focused, and I think it actually provides a really useful framework for about thinking about like decolonizing the atmosphere, land back, looking at nations that are plurinational, like settler colonialism. I think in the United States kind of glosses over or tries to flatten the plurinational and multiplicities of different groups in this country. So I think it provides a really beautiful framework and how to think about that on a local but also a global scale. And it's also like rights of nature too. I think there's this kind of liberal framework that kind of defangs the rights of nature movement. And Cochabamba, and also there, what's his name? Oh gosh, he was a Maori legal Jackson.
Matua Moana Jackson. Yeah, he just passed away just
Yeah,
recently. Yeah.
he was there. He helped draft these.
No, he was amazing. His work is incredible. I got a bunch of his books and stuff. He was quite close with a friend of mine and friend of the show, Emmy, who we were always saying is gonna come on some week soon, but never quite happens.
I was gonna ask you about that. It's like the when I think of Maori communists.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, we're a pretty tight crew. There's I feel like there's like quite a lot of us, and we all know each other, and we're all like like tangentially related in some way as well. So yeah, awesome, cool. All right, well, so homework is read the Cochabamba agreement. Also check out the Red Deal. And also, if you want bonus points, the Warrior Leonard Peltier documentary is on YouTube. I think the director of the documentary has put it up on her own account. It's like, it's high quality. It's not like a little 480p rip or anything like that. It's really good, easy watch. I watched it yesterday and it's great. It's a great one. It is from the early 90s. Other stuff has happened since then, but it's a great summation of the entire thing, not just his direct case, but all of the context and stuff surrounding it. So check that out as well. But awesome. Well, thanks for coming along. And if you ever want to come back, have a chat to us about anything else. If you've got a cause that you think needs any more attention to, we would love to have you back.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks,
Take
Nick.
it easy, Nick.
All right, Doksha.
Bye. Yeah, awesome show. Awesome. That means, sweet listeners, sweet chatters, anyone watching on the VOD channel, it's now time for us to tell you about the amazing opportunities available to you at the Red Planet Patreon. That's right. What a segue. So good at that, aren't I? You could go to patreon.com/red_planet and become a patron for as little as £2/$2/ I think it's $5
So Sprite mode is $3.50 a month.
$3.50
New Zealand.
Yeah. You can get all sorts of awesome benefits, and we are trying to, as we mentioned in the mid part of the show, to raise enough money to get a editor on board who will edit things for us so we can put them on TikTok or YouTube or another video platform that I don't know of. So please consider that in your decision to become a patron. But why don't you tell us some of the amazing benefits of Sprite mode, Kira?
I'd love to, Mule. I also like to add, in addition to what Mule said, by the way, that if we also are trying to raise money to do Red Planet documentaries. Sophie already made one about the ZAD, and it's going to be awesome. But also, Sophie and I want to arrange travel to Atlanta in America. So Sophie and me, and maybe even more of the hosts, want to travel to Atlanta, Georgia, to do a Red Planet documentary about Cop City. Please become a patron, even for the smallest amount of $2 a month.
Oh, she's muted.
Oh, she's muted. She doesn't even know she's muted. She's just...
I'm muted. I'm back. I'm back. For as little as $2 a month, aka how many pounds?
It's two.
Two. And then how many New Zealand?
$3.50 New Zealand.
All right.
No mute.
Okay. I'm not mute. Okay, hang on. All right, I'm back officially. I'm not doing push to talk anymore. Sprite mode for $2 a month, or all the other amounts that we just talked about. Get started for your support for Red Planet by becoming a Sprite. Benefits include the sacred and forbidden knowledge that you are helping the Red Planet team, early access to VODs, access to the Red Planet Discord, and supporting us. And also, you will have access to the upcoming podcast that we're doing, which we will be formally announcing soon.
Whoa.
Yeah, so much stuff just for $2 a month. Come on. But what if I want to support Red Planet a little bit? Big a couple more things. What can I do, Tim?
So the next step up, if you want to, is Goblin mode for New Zealand, $17.50 a month. $10 American, and probably about £10. Is that right?
£8.50.
£8.50. You can get Goblin mode. Everyone loves Goblin. We all get a little Goblin from time to time. Complete your gobology by going Goblin mode with everything from Sprite mode, a pack of cool Red Planet stickers for you to stick in legal places and only in places like that. And access to exclusive Red Planet Discord hangouts. So if you go Sprite mode, you get into the Discord, but Goblin mode and up, we do like live hangouts where we it'll be like a couple of hosts will be hanging out, watching like a TV show, documentary, something, and just talking about it, having a little bit of back and forth directly with each other and with chat and stuff. It's less formal than our already informal Red Planet process, but but that's a lot of fun as well. Like what we've done in the past, we've done like documentaries. We did there was one where me and Kira did some Star Trek episodes and talked about the themes, the politics in there, we've got a bunch more coming up. We'll announce when we've got another one of those coming up. But what's after that, Mule? What's the next step up the ladder?
Thanks for asking, Tim. It's Beast mode. It's £17 a month, $25, I think. And in New Zealand dollars, it's got to be like
34.50. Yeah.
Oh,
that is so
close. Holy shit, are you actually going to go beast mode? Well, then we can offer you all the stuff from the other lower tiers and pin badges. Yep, pin badges. Wear your excellent new Red Planet pin badge literally everywhere. It's completely cool and good to do so. Legal as well, so you know it's good. But listen, there's something else. There's some people out there just aren't satisfied with being a sprite, a goblin, or a beast. And some people are just sick, aren't they, Kira? And what can we do for them? There must be something we can do.
Well, for our perverts, we have sicko mode.
We got to change this.
Yeah.
Our producer does not approve of this segment, just for the record. Sicko mode for $100 a month, or for
I think 172 a month, New Zealand.
Or for Mule.
I'm sorry, I'm typing in the chat how much Conrad hates us. If you, it's £85, 85
Thank
British
you.
pounds.
If you support us this much, we can only really reasonably offer you all of the stuff from the lower tiers, plus a very special thank you message at the end of every stream. So thank you to our 3 sickos, JBP, Nerlon Starfire, and Queen Pib. Holy moly cannoli. Y'all are ridiculous.
3.
Thank you.
3
Holy moly
sickos.
Sickos.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Thanks for coming.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. So,
Also, I want to mention that we have merch, Queer Existence
do.
shirts and totes available at mercenarycreative.com. I really need I love this shirt that I got, by the way. I love it. And
There
I
we
live in like
go.
a cop town and I love wearing it around. It's just super fun. Queer Existence is Resistance. There's our beautiful Sophie demonstrating just how absolutely adorable you can look in one of our
doing
one of our Red Planet merch
queer
shirts.
existence right there.
You'll never be quite as beautiful or adorable as Sophie, but you can get close with this shirt. You can almost get close.
You'll almost have the sex appeal of a Red Planet host if you buy the shirt and wear it.
Imagine.
Yeah. But
so that's mercenarycreative.com if you want to grab some merch. So yeah. So and next week here we are. So next week we've got Jamie Peck coming on to talk about Cop City stuff, which obviously we talked a bit about already this week. And yeah, obviously, like, I mean, all this stuff like Cop City, land back, even like the over policing of, you know, like Native communities and, you know, like environmental activists. This all overlaps. This is our one struggle that we're always talking about. So next week James is going to come on. She's been teasing some kind of big announcement, I think sometime this week in regards to it. So in regards to the situation in general. So whatever that is, you want to find out more about that, you can hear it here next week on Red Planet. But yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about how people can find you in the meantime?
sure. You can find me go to my link tree, linktr.ee/Kira Chats, but all my stuff is under Kira Chats. All of my not safe for work, unmentionable websites are Kira Chats. My Twitter, twitter.com/Kira Chats, Blue Sky, KiraChats.bsky.social, Blue Sky, my Discord, discord.gg/Kira Chats, which we do a ton of community stuff together. So follow me in any of those places. Right now, I am streaming on Twitch. That's my full-time job, is twitch.tv/Kira Chats, and I'm currently doing a Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough. This is a brand new stab for me to try playing any of these types of games before. So chat's been really helpful. It's been really fun. I've been dressing up as like a different kind of elfin-y variant every day.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's been really fun. So we're going to play more tomorrow. So just, hang out with me there, twitch.tv/Kira Chats. But Mule, we're friends, right?
Oh, yeah.
we're friends like in real life. Like we're actually friends.
Real life.
Since you're my friend, I would love to know, how can I help support my friend?
What you can do is you can go to patreon.com/DJ Mule, DJMUEL, and become possum tier or above, because today I have finally fucking released my first ever Patreon exclusive content, which was supposed to be a monthly thing. It is going to be a monthly thing moving forward. I don't know what I was thinking. I decided to review like maybe 30 fucking movies in one video, so it ended up being like 2 hours long. So you could go and check out that absurdly long video there. Some of the movies that I review include Pink Flamingos, The Whale, and Malignant. So all those, you can hear all my opinions
Pink
on
Flamingos,
those movies.
eh?
Pink Flamingos, yeah. I will just say that, like, Pink Flamingos, oh boy,
it's a time.
It's not a good time, but it is also a good time. But it isn't. But it awful. Oh boy, Kira, you would not. No way. You're not going to watch that movie.
No way. Never watch that.
No,
never.
Don't watch it.
Promise us now you will never watch Pink Flamingo.
It's vile. It's absolutely vile.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, there's some good bits. Anyway.
Yeah,
so,
but.
Yeah. It's just vile. But yeah, so like I review a bunch of different fucking movies, and you can hear my opinions on all those things if you go to patreon.com/DJ Mule and become either a possum tier, which is £5 a month, or above. If not, then I will accept a goblin tier, which is £2. I mean, it's not great, but you know, whatever. And failing that, then I guess just, you know, like, share, retweet all my content over at linktree.ee.
If you're failing that.
/ just because it's a failure, isn't it? It's a failure to not support
this
me like
greedy
that.
streamer.
I'm trying to, you know, get in on the Kira Chat's brand. I'm trying, but
yeah,
you know,
you crush them, and then they're like, and then you lift them up a centimeter, and they're like so grateful.
That's how you do it.
That's how you do it.
But yeah, go to linktree.ee/DJ Mule. All my stuff is there. But Tim, sweet Tim, what about you?
You can find me here on Twitch and over on YouTube as Conquest of Dread. Or you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky as Dread Conquest. Yeah, mainly I haven't been streaming that much. I was going to stream a bit this month because it's like Twitch's like Maori language month thing, which I did a lot of streams for last year. But just with the moving and stuff, I have been busy, and I completely forgot to reply to their email. So sorry, Twitch ANZ, if you're watching. Sorry about that. But so I'm probably not going to be streaming this month. But yeah, who knows? Sometime in the future. I said last time that I would like to do some Baldur's Gate streams, but I'm thinking maybe after I finish the game, I'll just load up a shitload of mods and do a modded playthrough, and we can really, you know, we can see how deep that rabbit hole goes. But yeah, until then, you'll just see me on here, Red Planet. Yeah, and Soph isn't here, but we can give out all her links anyway. So Sophie from Mars is Sophie from Mars on pretty much everything. If you look up Sophie from Mars, you're gonna find Sophie from Mars. The Patreon, the big one, patreon.com/Sophie from Mars. Yeah, Blue Sky, Twitch, YouTube, or Sophie from Mars. If you just go to the linktree, linktree.ee, Sophie from Mars, you'll see everything there. She's got a great new video called The World Is Not Ending. You can look that up on YouTube. A great big one that she spent a lot of time on. It's really good. And yeah, she's been in France filming footage for our first proper Red Planet documentary. So that's coming up soon. Yeah, but she'll be back on the stream from next week, I'm assuming. Cool, awesome. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming along, and we will see you next week with Jamie Peck for Stop Cop City. Fingies out in the chat for that one.
Fingies out in the chat for that one. We'll see you next week.